Human behavior doesn't run on objective reality. It's driven by meaning and context. Google, Starbucks, Uber, they're really the product of a psychological discovery, not a technological one. Uber doesn't necessarily reduce your wait time for a cab. What it does is it reduces the psychological pain of waiting because you can see there's a car on the way. That's what changes the game. You can make something worth 10 times as much money simply by tweaking with the brain, not the thing itself.
Well, it's magic.
I think that the whole advertising industry has totally lost the plot and that it has become obsessed with that part of advertising which is a media and targeting optimization process. If we assume only that our job is to be the best at something, and if we define ourselves by our competitors, we'll be even worse because we're trying to be better at something that a lot of people are already good at. What's the point of doing that?
Don't be second in a category, invent a new category where you're first.
Exactly. Innovation tends to happen around the edges. The people who successfully innovate are often quite happy to go against the grain, become comfortable with ambiguity. The more ways in which you can look at something, the richer you are.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Rory Sutherland is the quintessential British ad man. He reminds me of the Don Draper of the UK. He's worked for Ogilvy for over 30 years, and he has a new book out called Alchemy, The Surprising Power of Ideas That Just Don't Make Sense. And that's what marketing is. You're trying to sell things to humans, and humans don't always act logically, and they do weird things. And he talks about things like the placebo effect, how governments try to get things done and actually don't. And he says that a weed is just a flower without a marketing budget. And Rory is a fascinating guy. It's his second time on London Real, and he really gets in to understand the human psyche, and I know you're going to enjoy this episode. This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Rory Sutherland, the British advertising icon and vice chairman of Ogilvy, one of the largest marketing and communication companies in the world. You are known as an expert on consumer behavior, market trends, and the influence of the internet, earning awards for your work on Microsoft, Unilever, and IBM. You write for The Spectator, you've given multiple TED Talks, and your new book, Alchemy, explores why placebos are so effective, why logic doesn't always pay, and the surprising power of ideas that don't make sense. Rory, welcome back to London Real.
It's a joy to be back. Thank you very much, Brian.
Great having you here. It's been 4 years since we sat down, and I wanted to ask you to start off, what has changed in 4 years in your world of understanding human behavior, technology, advertising influence? What's the first thing that comes to mind?
One of the strangest things that comes to mind is that, in truth, not that much is happening. And this sounds a very strange thing, and it's worth discussing. Because my generation, leaving aside the internet and maybe low-cost air travel, okay, nothing really significant has happened. Now that sounds a ridiculous thing to say.
But that's why you're here.
So two transformative technologies, what an utterly absurd thing to say. If you compare my grandmother, who was born in 1900, where they probably didn't, actually the other grandmother was born in about 1895, they wouldn't have had electric light for the first 15 years of their existence. Laundry would have occupied a day of your life. What she saw between 1895 and roughly 1980 was inordinately more pronounced, I think, in terms of the level of innovation and life-changing technology than what we've seen.
Interesting. So it's slow.
My argument, there's something very strange going on. And I always ask this question. Americans are in a state of extraordinary kind of dissatisfaction in a way because they can't recapture the American dream.
All right, tell me more about this.
Now, I ask the question sometimes, one, was the American dream partly a dream because no other country at the time could share it? So 1945 to 50, the United States had 50% of world GDP.
Yeah.
Okay.
They were the only country that wasn't destroyed in the war.
It was the only country which wasn't either poor to begin with or totally destroyed by war or just generally irredeemably crappy in some way. In this period, an extraordinary number of new innovations became accessible to someone on median income, certainly, even actually someone on low income.
Right.
I think when
Cars, housing.
Refrigerators,
Yeah.
for example. Now, those things were available in 1910, 1920, if you're a Rockefeller, but essentially a whole bunch of things became available to Americans which wouldn't be really commonly available anywhere else for another 20, 30 years. I mean, supermarkets, extraordinary cars. My father used to get American car magazines in his youth, in the sort of 1940s. And he said, reading an American car magazine in, say, 1942, as a 12-year-old English boy, was like reading science fiction. So there were things like, for example, a convertible with an electric hood, okay, which wouldn't really be seen or commonplace in the UK for another sort of 30 or 40 years. Right. The cars were just astounding. The world depicted. I watch and repeatedly watch, because it's a sensational film, North by Northwest. Yeah. And you have to remind yourself as a Brit that this was, 1950?
Probably around there. 50s,
okay.
Yeah.
Now, if you look at the train or the architecture of some of the buildings, for example, it's of a kind which, to a Brit watching it, would have seemed absolutely astounding. There's a famous comment made about a later film, 1960s, Psycho, which is that the shower scene, the shower murder, had slightly less impact in Britain than it did in the United States, because in the UK in 1960, people were astonished by the idea of a hotel room with an ensuite toilet, right? And so they were still getting around the fact that you had a shower, which was by no means, a shower in a hotel room would have been a complete oddity in 1960
in Britain.
Okay. Having an adjacent shower and toilet in a basic motel would have been unthinkable. My uncle went to Texas in the late 60s, and they apologized to him that there was a black and white television in his hotel room, right? And he was a bit baffled because, he hadn't expected colour TV. He hadn't expected a TV in his room at all. Right. Because a British hotel at that period, older listeners will know this, you had a television room which was set to one channel, and the residents of the hotel came down and sat in chintz chairs and watched the television.
Right.
Okay.
So the Americans had the American dream.
So they had this American dream, and it was partly a dream because no one else had it. And I always wondered, it must slightly piss you off now as an American. Because to be absolutely honest, okay, you've got this kind of narrative that France or Spain or Italy are like really poor and shitty compared to the United States. And yet in terms of those basic possessions, those life-enhancing possessions, there's not much difference, is there? To be absolutely honest, okay. Yeah. It's not as if there's this new weird form of technology coming in which really rich people can afford that no one else can. And I'm in the weird position. Now, I talk to a few other tech people on Twitter about this, and we don't like to talk about it much because it makes you look like a kind of first world problem, bit of a spoiled arsehole. But we actually say, look, the weird thing about tech is, one, of course, electronic tech, internet tech, is extraordinarily egalitarian in many ways, in that it's a bit like Warhol's great comment on Coke, which is, all the Cokes are the same and all the Cokes are good. The President of the United States can't get a better Coke than the bum on the corner of the street. Right. And now, okay, I'm sounding like a bit of an arsehole to say that tech's like that. But actually, if you're a Premiership footballer, you have a PS4, you might be able to buy it 3 months earlier than someone on median income. But ordinary people can buy that same thing which when you think about it is extraordinary, the extent to which most people, in the UK, someone on median income who really, really wanted to could effectively have the best mobile phone handset in the world. Okay. There are other categories like that. Sherry is a weird one for some reason, where I don't know why this is. The most expensive bottle of wine in the world costs hundreds of thousands of pounds. The best sherry in the world, you can pretty much, for some reason, sherry is never premiumized or has lost its premium quality to a degree. But that's extraordinary. But there's also an extraordinary thing, which is if you gave me 100,000 quid and said, okay, take this to your branch of Curry's PC World or whatever, and use it to improve your life, I could get a few marginal improvements in. I might buy a massive projector, I guess. I don't know. I might buy a bigger television. My wife would probably stop me. And I actually, to be honest, after I'd spent about 2,000 quid, I'd be at a loss to know what to do.
Okay. And so what does that mean? Is that
so there's something strange, which is we always talk about economics, and everybody measures how much money people have got to spend. But equally important to me in economics is consumption and what people have to spend their money on.
Right.
And I'm almost becoming a bit of a socialist, which is weird for someone like me, in the sense that if all the very rich end up doing with their excess money isn't, now, okay, my grandparents, they had the 4th dishwasher in Wales, okay? That was a massive status symbol then, if they'd wanted it to be. I mean,
yeah.
And they weren't particularly blingy, they just loved practical gadgetry. And this thing was the price of a car, practically. Okay. But a dishwasher is a real thing. It's a transformational, brilliant idea, which, you know, I mean, put it this way, it's a technology which, if yours broke, you would immediately set about getting it fixed, right? You wouldn't go, I'm perfectly happy for 4 weeks without a dishwasher, would you really?
No. So your point is that
My point is there isn't anything.
Right. So rich people today, even if you make an extra million, you go consume, your life isn't going to be marginally increased.
So there is a phrase that describes
this American dream of making our lives a lot better.
So part of the reason the American dream was a dream was that you were enjoying it while everybody else was having a nightmare.
Right.
But part of the reason the American dream was a dream was that your extraordinary non-shittiness of your economy for that glorious period also coincided with an extraordinary number of things which were suddenly affordable, which were really worth buying. Okay, yeah. So no one's going to dispute the fact that a car is a big thing. Okay,
yeah. And now
no one's disputing the fact that a dishwasher, washing machine, fridge is a huge thing.
And now we don't have that anymore.
You don't really have.
And so we're a little upset that we don't have that dream.
Well, I mean, how can you laud it? How do you laud it over the Spanish when? Okay.
Well, we can't anymore.
You can't really, can you? Because in terms of basic quality of life, I wonder if there's a kind of weird. It's worth remembering that, to some degree, economics has always assumed that actually, the left has always assumed that human wants are kind of finite, if you like, and therefore, socialism that provides people with the basis of their needs. The right has always argued, no, actually what made consumerism extraordinary is that, and what made communism not work, is that the ingenuity of capitalism was continually providing people with what you might call instrumental advantages.
Yeah.
So there's a great phrase which is, as well as economic inequality, there's instrumental inequality, which is the difference between what rich people can do and what poorer people can do. And until someone invents something really weird, okay, I mean, maybe there is some strange, like, one-person self-flying drone that I can climb in and I can get to work and land on the roof in 20 minutes from Sevenoaks, and that costs 90,000 quid or 150,000 quid. Now, actually, what Silicon Valley will do is it will Uberize that technology. It won't actually sell it to me.
Right. It'll just equalize it.
It'll essentially just
that's where the bigger market share
Uber Lux is an extraordinary thing, by the way. Do you ever use it?
I have used it. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Don't tell too many people, because I don't want to reduce availability. But for a little bit more than the black cab, you get an S-Class Mercedes turning up. Now, Uber Lux is essentially, now obviously it's not something you'd use every day, but it's essentially a chauffeur when you want one for 20 or 30 quid a pop.
Right, so really good value there.
I mean, it's extraordinary.
Let me
So there's this interesting thing, which is, until we can actually argue, okay, the people who are wealthier are buying significant instrumental, practical advantages with their money, and by doing so are funding the affordability of those same things to everybody else. You know, the great role that I think income inequality did play is in many cases the rich funded the early development of things like washing machines, televisions, radios, and then eventually those things through mass manufacture became more and more affordable over time.
Okay.
So there's an argument that what rich person's status seeking did was it was in a way the status seeking of rich people was a kind of R&D funding exercise for the wider population.
Okay.
Now, if people only spend their money on property, for example, or on sitting in the front of the plane rather than the back, that same useful function doesn't seem to be being performed.
Okay, understood. Let me ask you about something that happened yesterday, and I want to get Rory's marketing perspective of this. We have a new prime minister. His name is Boris Johnson, who was there on probably the back of the Brexit vote, which is a marketing phenomenon itself, which I'd like to ask you about. But Boris, he is, and you talk about this in your book, illogical. You look at him as a candidate, you remember the Tony Blairs and the Bill Clinton days. I mean, they all had personal stylists and people that would cut their hair and do their makeup, and it was considered that was always going to be the leader. That was this obvious, I don't know what it is, perfect person. But now you have someone like Boris Johnson. How does that play from a logic, illogic, that is our leader now? Is that intentional? If you were his marketing guru, could you create that?
I think he's his own marketing guru for good and ill, and I think that's true of Trump as well. And me and a bunch of other people have also made the point that Trump is instinctively much, much cleverer than intellectual people think he is.
Right, he's instinctively clever, not intellectually clever.
No, well, I don't think, by the way, I don't think the man is a total idiot, by the way, which is a common aspersion by any means. And he has a certain negotiator's instinct and a certain communicator's instinct, which you might expect a real estate salesman to have.
Definitely. Always bluffing, always coming on strong.
And actually, one of the things he does also, which is, I wrote a piece about this. There's a strange, if you take the sort of social justice movement, and there's a wonderful paper in a website called, I think, Ario, which makes this point. It's become a kind of religion. And weirdly, a large part of the behavior of the social justice movement is actually deeply counterproductive. Because if you get really, really obsessed about, for example, certain speech codes, and you react to the violation of those codes in the way that a religious person would react to blasphemy, okay? And therefore what you do is you evidence disgust. Generally, your opponents hate you. So the two things I think that the social justice movement has which make it look like, in a sense, deeply flawed Protestantism, okay, is one, weirdly, they turn on themselves to an extraordinary degree. There's no concept of kind of solidarity because they actually hate an apostate or a heretic more than they hate an atheist. Okay, so that's the first thing. So they will turn on people who are actually, well, they'll turn on Jermaine Greer and they'll turn on Peter Tatchell, for fuck's sake. Oh, sorry.
It's all right.
Okay.
Why is that? And why is that?
Okay.
Why is that bad?
How,
explain those two cases if people
so
don't know that.
That's extraordinarily bad for creating a kind of cohesive movement where you're competing to show moral purity to a point where actually you'll start condemning people who are who you should be actually admiring.
Okay, part of your movement, but then you condemn them.
The second thing is your reaction of disgust and horror. People really, really hate being treated with contempt. And what Trump did, as I said, he found the thermal exhaust port on the liberal Death Star because he had to just cross one of these lines a little bit, okay, by saying bad hombres, okay. He knew all those people, including journalists, by the way. I'm not only just talking about, the head of gender studies at the, whatever it is, college, okay, some liberal arts college. He knew that those people and the press would go batshit crazy about it and start calling him a racist. And he knew that reaction was actually net to his electoral advantage, particularly in the places which he needed to win. Because the extent to which the left has abandoned what you might call its old economic aims and become insanely preoccupied with gender and race to the exclusion of almost anything else, is an extraordinary kind of Achilles heel. And Trump exploited that because he knew, okay, if I simply behave in this way, the press will actually give me an insanely disproportionately high amount of publicity. And to some extent, I hate to say this, but fame is basically good, okay? By being 5 times more famous than all the other contenders for the Republican nomination, simply generating noise basically works in that context. Now, Johnson's interesting because Corbyn's also interesting because Corbyn and Johnson are, although very different politically. If you think about Corbyn, someone should have realised very quickly that he was going to win that election for the Labour Party leadership anyway, even without a lot of kind of extreme left-wing people mobilising, simply because you had 3 very identical candidates and 1 distinctive one. And it's kind of like, I think Dave Trott calls it Gestalt theory. But if you have a whole screen of zeros with an X in the middle, the human brain spots the X in about a millisecond.
Right. Is this where politics and marketing?
So the 3 identical candidates split the vote. Corbyn as the 4th candidate. This is why, by the way, the Tory leadership election at least narrows it down to 2 before it goes out to a public vote, because otherwise you have that fundamental problem, which is that you have the XXXY problem, which is essentially, the 3 X's are indistinguishable and therefore divide support, whereas the one distinctive person attracts everybody on a particular part of the spectrum.
Okay, understood.
The fact that he had a beard was pretty much a winner. You could have put anybody forward with a beard, and I think they would have won.
Just to have that distinct
if he won
aspect.
if Andy Burnham had been persuaded to wear a large beanie hat throughout the campaign, he probably would have won.
Is that what Boris did?
No, well, Boris does the same thing, which is he's distinctive. And it's worth remembering that...
is that by design, or is that his personality?
It's both, I suspect.
Same with Trump.
Well, I suspect, to be honest, I think he knows that he can't play the other game. Okay.
Right. So why bother? So just
why bother?
And magnify it a bit.
Secondly, it's worth remembering, of course, that I was slightly defending his role to my wife, who doesn't like this at all, by saying that actually leadership qualities and show business qualities are much, much scarcer in politics than administrative ability. Now everybody goes, no, a good politician, he's the prime minister, he should be, have high quality. Now actually, you can outsource that stuff. You can delegate that stuff.
The administrative.
The ability to be a figurehead might be, and I would argue, I have no idea, okay. To be honest, I suspect that Richard Branson, I think he might be dyslexic, actually, an extraordinary figure, which is a remarkable number of entrepreneurs are actually dyslexic. I generally don't know how good Richard Branson is at running a spreadsheet, okay, reading a spreadsheet, or how good he'd be if you asked him to perform some complicated feat of logistics.
No, I think he outsources a lot of that.
But exactly. But being the figurehead for an airline and saying this is what this airline is about, it's not like other airlines, okay? Yeah. He does something which very few heads of a PLC could do. And I think we are suffering this problem where organizations are increasingly, Apple, kind of run by the finance director.
Right.
And I'm sure that Tim Cook is a much better finance director than Steve Jobs would have been.
Right.
But in terms of creating that extraordinary distinctiveness, and in terms of unifying an extraordinarily vociferous and cranky group of people like Apple employees stroke Brits, the value of what Johnson does, even though I'm by no means an unqualifying fan. I have huge doubts on all sorts of levels.
But he is a leader and a figurehead.
It's a scarcer human quality than administrative ability.
Okay. And do you think corporates need it as well? Do you think Apple needs more of a Jobs figure as opposed less of a Tim Cook figure?
I think it's hugely valuable to have within a business. I would say this, wouldn't I? But within a business, to have someone at the top who essentially is happy to go against the grain,
Okay. Is
some
this
extent.
you in your case, in your company?
I'm only the vice chairman. I don't have, but I think having a percentage of people, as you would do in an ad agency, having a creative director who's a highly distinctive character, those things are really, really useful. If you think about it, the great ad agencies were all founded by creative people. You go back, Bernbach, Ogilvy, etc. And what has happened is they've become overly administrative in that managerial qualities are probably over-rewarded, and creative, so in other words, the people who measure and count the money are becoming, in all organizations, more valued than the people who generate the value.
Right, the creatives, right.
Yeah.
You mentioned America and the American dream, and is that really where modern marketing was born? When you had all of a sudden this lower and middle class, you had all this stuff to sell them, people had a choice because it wasn't communist Russia, so now, is that when marketing evolved? Or was
and I suppose you also had an interesting thing, because what we often forget, a few episodes of Mad Men make this clear, is a surprise.
Do you like Mad Men? Do you like watching it?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's both it's both actually very accurate and very inaccurate as a depiction
and
of the time.
And you knew the later versions of those Mad Men when you started?
I still know one or two people who, Joel Raffleson in Chicago, he and his wife were both copywriters in Ogilvy in the 50s and 60s.
Okay.
I had a very interesting observation. I went out to dinner with them both, and I said, to what extent is it an accurate depiction of... and Joel himself said, oh, it was nothing like that. I mean, the depiction of the philandering and the drunkenness and so forth, I mean, really, it's monstrously overblown. And his wife turned to him and said, Joel, it was exactly like that. So, depending on the male or female perspective, it's worth remembering, by the way, it was complicated in that there would have been a large number of agencies in the 50s, I'm not sure it didn't include J. Walter Thompson, major agencies which wouldn't even handle alcohol accounts.
Okay.
So we've got to remember that, of course, America was only 20 years, 30 years after Prohibition. There was still, quite a lot of America was very, very puritanical then.
Okay.
But presumably, agencies did start to spring up, which were much, much more maverick in all sorts of ways.
Okay.
But I mean, Jeremy Bullmore remembers that a bunch of American board directors came over and attended the JWT Christmas party in London, and were reported back, the directors' wives reported back with some horror that there was quite a lot of dancing. So, I mean, that is the strangest thing about the United States, which is your utterly bizarre and actually, in some ways, I think, irreconcilable mixture of weird sexual and other license combined with Puritanism.
It always works that way.
It always. But I mean, Britain, I think, has reached a kind of accommodation.
Yeah, well, you're closer to the continent where people are, but it's somewhere in between. But I say Britain is, it has less.
We're kind of in mid-Atlantic, I think, aren't we? I think.
Yeah.
We've never had a big hang-up about booze, really. I mean, that's never been a thing.
But yeah, America definitely has that. Well, Ad Men, that was kind of what Wall Street was later, what the oil business was like later, what tech was like later. I mean, that's where the action was, right? That's where the hot shots went.
Of course, you had 50% media commission. You had the sudden coming of television, which was extraordinarily potent. You also had this thing which we often forget, which is a surprising number of American brands were at the time regional. And so there was essentially, with the coming of national distribution and national media to support national distribution, because remember, if you think about it, your newspapers, you've never really had a national newspaper.
Sure.
Okay, back then. So the extent to which television, by dint of being national, forced these once slightly regional brands to compete for national dominance in a kind of winner-takes-all competition, that must have driven extraordinarily high ad spend.
Yeah.
And so probably by dint of receiving commission, there were agencies which were, for a short time at least, 10, 15 years, I mean, literally insanely rich. I mean, it would have been an extraordinary way because they simply copied the commission and payment system from press.
Okay.
And of course, so, when you multiply the numbers by 10 or 15, these numbers became spectacular.
So lavish expense accounts, real estate, the pay packages, that's what we see kind of in Mad Men and everything. And is there still a hangover from that marketing to today?
You also have a slightly advantageous thing, which is because you were effectively paid by your clients, but because the money, the commission, came from the the media owner. And you were technically, I think it was in Britain, it was illegal to rebate commission to anybody else for a long time. So in a weird way, you weren't entirely paid by your clients. They could withdraw their business, but they weren't actually writing checks to you. They wrote checks to the media, and you got your 15%. And that probably gave you an independence of mind as well, because you weren't always there haggling about what the blended hourly rate was.
Okay, gotcha. So, and how did that carry over to where we are today when it comes to marketing? You said the American dream is still some twisted version of that's old, is still in the consciousness, but, you know.
Well, no, it does interest me about the American dream, which is that it was partly a dream because everybody else was having a bit of a nightmare.
Yeah, definitely.
And it's also interesting because I don't think, barring some strange nuclear catastrophe, I don't think you're ever going to see one country being that much relatively richer than everyone else, or at least relatively better in terms of quality of life. Now, the reason I raise all these questions about instrumental inequality is I would argue that we ought to now start looking for improvements in quality of life. Now, bear in mind, this is going to sound like weirdly left-wing. It's simply pragmatic, okay? We should start to look to improve people's life with greater amounts of leisure rather than necessarily with greater amounts of money.
Okay.
Because at some point, if the money is being spent in a way that is either completely rivalrous, the property market, essentially just inflated because people are competing for scarce commodities, zero-sum game, okay? The washing machine was not a zero-sum game.
Right.
Okay, that was, that's an enormous benefit. Now, here's a great thought experiment, okay? If you ask people, it's Robert H. Frank, who wrote a book called The Darwin Economy, fantastic economist and evolutionary psychologist. If you ask people, would you rather live in a world where you earned £50,000 a year and everybody else earned 30? Or would you rather live in a world where you earned £80,000 a year and everybody else earned 100? Okay. Quite a lot of people choose the first. And the reason they choose the first is not irrational, because relative wealth, in some respects, if you're trying to attract the opposite sex, for instance, if you want to buy beachfront housing, okay, may be much more important than absolute wealth. In fact, when you go to Ogilvy, what's slightly painful about Ogilvy is the chief executive of Ogilvy in London and the chief executive of Ogilvy in New York probably have the worst quality of life, I would argue, objectively, of any major senior person in Ogilvy. If you're the head of Ogilvy in a Latin American country, okay, you don't earn as much as the person in New York does, but your house is bloody spectacular, okay, right? It's on some cliff overlooking a tropical beach, whereas the person in New York's, they've got a nice apartment, but it's nothing to write home about. Now, if you ask just a different question, which is, would you rather live in a world where you had 4 weeks vacation and everybody else got 5, or would you rather live in a world where you got 6 weeks vacation and everybody else got 8? Sorry, have I got that right?
Yeah.
Most people say I'd rather live in the 6-week vacation world,
right,
because vacation is not a relative status good, it's an absolute good, and more of it is better than less, regardless of what everybody else has. So leisure time is a good. It's not a competitive, rivalrous good like money is for chasing property, I would argue, personally, I think the whole travel industry has gone batshit crazy, okay? In that, for young people who have anyone, hey, cars aren't really a status thing anymore. In fact, I don't own a car. Right? Okay.
Is that your young voice?
Sorry, my young person voice. I don't even own a car. I probably belong to a car club. Okay, and I think it was now.
But they use travel.
But they use travel as a status indicator. Right. I think if you went to university now, and you'd never been anywhere long haul, you'd be at a significant mating disadvantage to some git who'd been to Machu Picchu. And so they just have different, the status competition is the same, the currency changes.
Okay.
Now, I asked an audience of millennials and young folk in a room once, all London resident, okay, how many of you have been to Machu Picchu? And then I asked, how many of you have been to see Lincoln Cathedral? And the ratio was about 2 or 3 to 1. Machu Picchu. Now, you can go to Lincoln Cathedral in the day from London, okay? Now, okay, whatever you want to say. 1, you don't get altitude sickness, okay? 2, architecturally, it's a lot better. Machu Picchu, right? Thirdly, I'm not even sure watching a 4K documentary on Machu Picchu wouldn't be more valuable than actually going there, to be absolutely honest. Now, so the really interesting thing there is that leisure is something people enjoy for its own sake, whereas money, I think, is increasingly something people enjoy for the business of pursuing personal status and rivalry, which is a zero-sum game.
Okay, and that affects the way we market to people today.
Well,
It really does.
I think we've got to ask questions. We've got to start asking questions about. I mean, there are economists. I mean, weirdly, there's a strange economic movement called something like post-scarcity luxury communism,
Okay.
which essentially says that we become so efficient at manufacturing and distributing goods that that nearly everybody in the world who wants to will eventually be able to live a life of considerable opulence. Okay. Now, at that point, you actually need to introduce communism, essentially, in order to simply because.
Money doesn't motivate anyone.
Or what you might end up with is absurd inequalities of wealth.
Okay. We'll see if we get there.
We'll see if we get there.
In the book, you talk about this concept of perception versus reality, and you make a great example in the first part about Coca-Cola versus Red Bull. And I think this is interesting because everyone watching has probably consumed both of those beverages. But tell me what you see when you see the way Red Bull introduced their product into a market that before had never seen anything like that, and how they did things that were unobvious and illogical. Because much of marketing is illogical, and that's why it's fascinating.
Well, I think there's a really vital thing which has actually importance not only for marketers and market researchers, also for people doing artificial intelligence and working with big data, which is the human behavior doesn't run on objective reality. It's not driven by objective reality. It's driven by meaning and context. So the same thing in a different context can appear totally different to the human mind and therefore lead to totally different behavior. Even though the thing itself may be the same, simply changing the context changes everything.
Right. I always think of the Mark Twain book.
Repainting the fence.
Repainting the fence, yeah, where he gets his friends to pay him to paint the fence.
The fence, because if you portray fence painting, and of course, if you think about that, we see examples of that. There's a wonderful Onion parody about upper middle class women in sort of Marin County engaging in candle making. Now, in the 18th century, candle making was a necessary piece of domestic drudgery, and the second you could actually buy ready-made candles, you were hugely grateful for the opportunity. But suddenly, what was once a kind of, an 18th century, necessary, totally tedious piece of drudge work, suddenly becomes a kind of, an extraordinary pleasure.
Right.
Bread making, another example,
Yeah.
And artisan basically means manufactured through an inefficient process, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Okay. And
Which is all the rage these days.
which is that's interesting in itself, because what it's evidence of, I think, the hipster movement, which I thoroughly endorse, by the way, is saying, look, actually, there isn't an equivalent to the washing machine anymore. Really, there isn't this thing that can really change my life. Now, by the way, the washing machine, if you think about it, really enabled women to enter the labour force, so its knock-on effects were much more significant than merely avoiding a day of drudgery.
Okay.
And so what we're going to do is we're going to do the things we always enjoyed. We're just going to do them better. So we're going to make really, really good toast. And actually, I find that business of doing basic, immutably good pleasures like breakfast and just saying, let's just do it incredibly well. I find that actually, it's, to be honest, the psychological value is probably more than the intrinsic value. But it's a pretty harmless way of our enjoying ourselves, I think.
Yeah, and perception
And
reality.
so I'm very pro-hipster. I think hipsters should be subsidised, actually.
Ha!
And it'd be a very interesting economic argument that you
Universal
should take.
basic
well, if
hipster
you
income.
pay hipsters to move into, I think they could solve the housing crisis. Because once you've got 2 or 3 hipster cafes, okay, any area becomes an acceptable place to live. If you've got high-speed fibre optic broadband and some hipsters, you've essentially gentrified.
You have a
Okay.
point there.
Okay, so
The government should
so
see-
actually paying hipsters to say there's a town in South Wales which really needs an artisan sourdough bakery.
You might be onto something
Okay,
there.
maybe-
So
okay.
you said
They're
perception
the shock
reality.
troops of
and you men-
gentrification.
And you
Yeah.
mentioned AI as well. So how does that? I had a guy in here.
Oh,
named-
okay. So it's the fact that what AI has access to is information about reality,
Yeah.
price, okay, information about behavior, sales. What it doesn't have information on is the weird black box of human perception that goes on in between. So let me give you an example of this. There were some bird perception scientists, I'm sure there's a better name for it than that, were doing experiments showing parrots photographs, right? And they were slightly baffled by the behaviour, the reaction of parrots to these photographs. And it was a mixture of things shown on screen and things shown in print. And for example, I'm making this up, but this could be the kind of thing. You might show them a picture of a ripe banana and they're completely uninterested. Okay. What you remember is parrot vision, okay, is, first of all, they can detect ultraviolet. Secondly, they have completely different sensitivity in their cones, in their eyes, to a totally different part of the wavelength. So remember, a photograph of a yellow banana and a TV picture of a yellow banana is not actually producing any yellow photons at all. It's producing equal amounts of red and green photons, and the red and green are calibrated to the areas of sensitivity in the human eye. And so your TV is species specific. All color printed magazines is species specific.
Okay, so what you're saying is...
Unless you actually print in real colors. Does anybody print in full?
I don't know.
I don't know.
So what's the point? The parrots are seeing these things and not reacting.
We go, parrots aren't interested in ripe bananas. But the parrot wasn't seeing a ripe banana. The parrot was seeing a banana that was green or black or I don't know what it was, but okay. But it wasn't seeing a ripe banana because actually what looks like a ripe banana to a human in print or on TV, not in reality, doesn't look like a ripe banana to a parrot, okay? And in the same way, what we might do when we look at big data is we might draw conclusions about the relationship between reality and behavior, which are entirely erroneous. One, we may assume I won't go into this in a huge amount of detail. We may assume a huge amount of ergodicity. So we may assume that what the average does once is what everybody does over time on average.
Right.
And that may be completely wrong. Okay.
Right.
So we may get, by having these snapshots and averaging them, we may assume that the average of a group, that the collective simultaneous average of a group behavior is representative of the over time average behavior of an individual within that group, which isn't a true assumption. Okay. So that's the ergodicity problem. The context problem is the Red Bull one. It's the parrot one, which is if you asked a load of people, what would make a great drink as an alternative to Coca-Cola? Everybody would tell you, accurately in a way, I want a drink that tastes nicer than Coke, costs less than Coke, and comes in a really big can so I get great refreshment for my money, okay? The most successful attempt to compete with Coke, Red Bull, does the opposite. It costs a fortune, comes in a tiny can, and it tastes disgusting, right? Now, when they researched the taste, people said this is disgusting. Now, my contention is, if you flip the context from drink to drug, those three qualities which make Red Bull an appalling drink make it a brilliant placebo. All medicinal products have to taste weird, otherwise we don't believe they're medicinal, right? If you think about it, everything has to taste a bit weird, right?
Yeah.
I think, to be honest, if you sell vitamin C, you can make it taste really tasty. Don't. I think the placebo effect is much stronger if you make it taste slightly foul.
Okay.
Red Bull, by the way, they researched it with a company that only researches the taste of carbonated drinks, and people basically said things like, the company said, this is the worst drink we've ever researched in the whole history of our company. Normally people say things like, it's too sweet for me. No, it's a drink for kids, really. Here they were saying things like, I wouldn't drink this piss if you paid me to. But as a drug, the small can says this drug's really potent, okay? Because we can't give you a full 375 milliliters. I don't know what that was. Sorry about that.
Your phone, maybe. And so it was marketed not as a drink, now as a drug. It gives you wings.
And therefore, the small quantity, the high price, and the weird taste, which in the context of perceiving a drink make it a very bad drink indeed, make it a brilliant drug.
Is that from the immutable laws of marketing where it says don't be second in a category, invent a new category where you're first?
Exactly, yeah. So in a sense it did create a category. And so the example I also give is if you look at people's pizza behaviour, nearly everybody orders their pizza for as soon as possible. And it was assumed in pizza delivery that what everybody wanted was basically instantaneous pizza delivery. We argue that maybe that's true, maybe it's context. Sorry, rephrasing Maybelline ad-end lines unconsciously there. The point being that the default on the web, if you order a pizza, is ASAP. The default on your mobile phone is ASAP. If you ring up, they never say, when would you like your pizza to arrive? They assume, unless you state otherwise, that you want it as soon as possible. Then we said, what if you just change the context of ordering, and particularly, so you don't assume that it's going to be immediate. You make the default further out than ASAP. But also what happens if you actually ask the question as a time of day, not as a duration? Because if you ask for it as a duration, people tend to go, I want it as soon as possible. If you ask for it, would you like to arrive at 8:15, 8:20, 8:25, 8:25, 8:30, a lot of people will go, well, I'd want it to arrive in half time, or actually I wouldn't mind having a shower. So why don't I get it to arrive in an hour's time? And if you change the question, you change the answer to the question. Okay. And so the huge danger is that people will derive from big data assumptions about what humans want, which are actually not a product of their deep desire. They're simply a product of the context in which something's perceived.
Okay, and that's why you still have a job.
And the reason we still have a job, on a very simple level, okay, I could very easily, this is obviously daft, but if you think about it, I could put £2,000 bags in Tesco, handbags, and I don't think I'd sell very many, okay? The same bag in Bond Street might walk off the shelves. Now, yeah, you could say, okay, target audience, no. Actually, it doesn't really matter. To be honest, even if really, really rich people are going to your local Tesco, they don't want to buy a £2,000 bag in Tesco. Secondly, in comparison with milk and microwave lasagna, £2,000 seems like a lot of money. In comparison with the other shit on Bond Street, it might well be a bargain, okay? Right. And so once you don't understand the contextual frame in which people decide, you only decide, you could make the totally erroneous assumption that there's no market for £2,000 bags.
Right.
And so there's this huge problem, essentially, which is that what we'll try and do when we have big data and when we have artificial intelligence, we'll try and look for connections between the things we know, i.e. what the price is, how many people buy it. And what we'll remain blind to is the really decisive factor, which is how is the thing presented. Before Starbucks, okay, if you'd gone around the United States and essentially said, would you willingly pay $3.50 for a coffee? No, would be the answer.
Especially not, and buy 3 a day.
Before Nespresso, if someone had said, would you actually pay 50p for a cup of coffee, all the data on how much people would pay for ground coffee or Maxwell House would tell you that people paying effectively £40 for the equivalent of a large jar of coffee is never going to happen. Right. Nespresso proves that wrong. If you frame the price differently, people are totally happy to do it. In the case of Starbucks, I mean, I think most of these huge companies, by the way, Google, Starbucks, Uber, they're really the product of a psychological discovery, not a technological one.
Okay.
I mean, Uber. If you think about it, Uber's technology is GPS. It's it's a map. I mean, it's rudimentary. Putting those two things together so that the uncertainty of waiting for a car is hugely diminished because you can see there's a car on the way.
Yeah.
And actually, while you're waiting for the car, you can have another cup of tea and make yourself a pint rather than staring anxiously out of the window. Okay, that's what changes the game.
So that's a psychological innovation.
Yeah, no. Because Uber doesn't necessarily reduce your wait time for a cab. What it does is it reduces the psychological pain of waiting. And the pain of waiting is created more by uncertainty than it is by duration.
Yeah, I remember last time you were here, you said something that really stuck with me, Rory. When you're in the tube these days, I'm on the Northern Line, you can see the next few trains, and it gives you the exact time, like 2 minutes or 4 minutes, and you're sitting there, and all of that uncertainty and angst is like, oh, it's coming, even though it's 6 minutes. And sometimes those things change in real time, but it feels certain. It feels accurate, especially because it's in a 1 minute increment.
The amusing thing is that the people on the tube have to go through extraordinary hoops to justify spending on live information systems. And the reason is that their objective measure of transportation is based on objective, not subjective measures. So the improvement, the reduction in anxiety doesn't count. The only thing that would actually matter is a reduction in wait time. And my argument is, look, if you can reduce anxiety without reducing wait time, it's going to be inordinately cheaper to do so, by the way. And by the way, I'm not suggesting you have a wait time of 45 minutes. I'm not suggesting this is a panacea. I'm merely suggesting that, I quite often catch trains from Blackfriars Station, which is essentially a bridge over the Thames. And sometimes I just wander there and just don't even bother to have a train in mind and sit on the platform. And the reason I do that is I know it's 12 minutes now before the train comes in. I can rebrand that 10 minutes as doing a crossword, or more likely, looking out onto the river, because it's a gorgeous view. Tourists would kill for that view of London. And so I actually sort of sit backwards or sideways on one of the benches and look out towards the river. And my view is that's not a waste of time at all.
Right, because it's been reframed.
Reframed.
And repackaged. Yeah. And so that's the innovations that the Ubers do and some of these other big companies.
I mean, I'm in an interesting position because I live equidistant between two stations. And interestingly, my use of one station, which was very, very low for the first few years I lived where I do, my use of that station went up by a factor of about 3 or 4 when a coffee shop opened there in the morning. Because the 15 minutes that had previously been, you allow a margin of error to catch the train, and the 15 minutes waiting had previously been irritating. And once there was a coffee shop with a nice guy to chat to and a bench on which to sit and drink a coffee and stare into space, essentially I no longer minded that wait anymore. And so my use of the station went from sort of, once a fortnight to twice a week.
Okay. You have a concept in your book where you say that we have 2 reasons for doing anything. There's the good reason and the real reason. And this comes down to
J.P. Morgan, I think, said that.
Yeah,
every man has 2 reasons for doing what he does, a good reason and the real reason. There's a huge amount of truth in this. We have an official reason for choosing things.
Is this to do with the reptile brain and then the frontal brain?
I was burbling on to you, wasn't I, about that name piece of hi-fi I bought, the name Muso. And to be honest, okay, I was saying the reason I justified it is I said, in all the explosion of Spotify, of Tidal, the fact that my music collection effectively online is now all music. I can listen to all of the world's radio stations, pretty much. I can listen to all of the world's classical music, all of the world's country, and other inferior forms of music as well. Slightly eccentric pairing there. Big fan of country. There's a lot of behavioural science.
A lot of country music fans in England, I'm finding out. In the advertising industry as well.
We never admit it. It's social death.
Thing.
But no, it's a copywriter's medium.
Okay.
I think if you're a copywriter, you actually secretly love country because the words are so damn good. But it's very weird because it's always seen as very, very white, okay, as a medium. But you go to the Caribbean, and actually when you think about it, reggae is Caribbean country, really, okay? And weirdly, people in the Caribbean absolutely love country music. So that stereotyping of it as being very, as being kind of cracker art form is very odd. But I suddenly realised, and I came up with this rational justification, didn't I? Okay, which was that what's crazy is when I had a limited record collection, I spent 500 quid on having a really good hi-fi. Now I have unlimited content. Other than buying expensive headphones, I haven't spent any money on home hi-fi other than a few Bluetooth speakers costing 100 quid. It's time for me to spend 600 quid on some of this stuff. Podcasts, audiobooks, we get those, okay?
Yeah.
So I'm rationalising the fact that name thing is literally 15 times more valuable than it would have been in 1980 because of the extraordinary content I can use it for. In truth, though, I bought it because it looks really fucking cool. Okay? Now,
that's the lizard brain making the decision.
My example is, okay, that toothpaste is the beautiful case where you actually have 2 reasons for doing it. Officially, it's all about dental health, right? Okay? It's all about preventing cavities, gum health, all those things. If you look at when people clean their teeth, 1, okay, first thing in the morning, yes, right? Before you go to work, yes. do you sometimes, being honest, if you have one of those weekends where you bum around in your pajamas or underpants watching TV and not going out of the flat, do you clean your teeth at those weekends? No, you don't, do you? Right? Because you're not going out of the house. Before a date, everybody would clean their teeth. Right? So actually, it's more about breath freshness and social anxiety, not dental health. Item 2, or exhibit 2 in this, 95% of all toothpaste is mint flavoured. Now, that does not make sense if it's about dental health. Principally about the anxiety of bad breath and or scuzzy teeth. The secondary benefit, which we use as our post-rationalisation, is all about dental health. Now, I think good advertisers understood this all along. Just think about, okay, this is, by the way, the most successful brand in Britain in terms of household penetration, Colgate. So, if you don't have anything by Colgate in your home, you're probably some sort of weird deviant. It's a bit like 10 years ago. If you didn't buy your underpants from Marks and Spencer's as a bloke, you're probably a bit iffy. There's something, you shouldn't be left alone with the silverware. If you, but the interesting thing about Colgate is that they understand this because what's the headline? The ring of confidence. Okay, it's very, very cleverly ambiguous. Because yes, if it's a mum taking the kid to the dentist, you could make an ad all about the fact that no fillings today, mum. But equally, the ring of confidence is really, if you're a teenage kid going out on Saturday night, you're not anxious about, knocking someone out with your halitosis.
Right. So you need to understand that most people make those decisions from these deep down inside insecurities, reptile brain,
Yeah, and actually... Yeah, the part of the brain that does the deciding isn't the part that does the explaining. It's a metaphor, but it's not.
Is that why Trump's been so successful? You see a guy on stage that, I used to watch Trump in the elections.
I think
he'd put all the pretty girls behind him, Ivanka and all the wives, and then he's up there, implying the billions of dollars and the real estate stuff.
He's a silverback. I'll tell you, he did. Okay, now this.
And the monkey part of you says he's the monkey leader. And then later you say, his policies are this. Is there something there?
Yeah, the silverback gorilla, the kind of... Okay, the thing he did, which I thought was utterly brilliant, okay, as a piece of advertising. And nobody commented on this. It should have won a Grand Prix at Cannes for effectiveness.
Okay.
Do you remember there was a picture of him in his plane? Fantastic opulence of the plane.
Eating McDonald's.
Eating KFC. It was KFC.
Okay.
Even better, you see, right? And gravy,
Yeah.
He did have a knife and fork, which he was slightly ridiculed for.
I remember that.
But equally, if you're on a private plane, you're going to have cutlery, or why use plastic cutlery if you've got the metal stuff? And what was utterly brilliant about this was, if you think about it, it was incredibly lucid, because it said, I've got a plane, right, but I eat the same food you guys do. Now, the two things: one, Hillary didn't have her own plane, okay? She didn't have fuck you money. If she had a plane, it was probably lent to her by Goldman Sachs, something, right? Okay. Second, you can't imagine Hillary eating KFC, can you?
No.
It would have been some avocado shit, or some weird. You can't imagine Hillary eating that stuff.
No.
And you can imagine Boris, can't you? Boris is a bit of a bit porky.
Yeah.
You can imagine Boris actually secretly sneaking off to the Colonel's finest establishment, for a couple of spicy hot wings.
I can see that, right? We can all see
You can
that.
see it.
Yeah.
And of course, one of the things that's vital about these people as well is that to us in London, we think politicians are people just like us. If you live in a normal part of the country, by which I mean not even outside the M25, if you just live towards the M25, okay, they're all drawn from this same bloody administrative caste of people who in the course of your everyday life you don't encounter very much, and when they do, they're a pain in the arse, like someone at the local council or a librarian or something, right?
Right.
And this administrative caste is actually... so let me get this right. I think the first Attlee cabinet, 45, okay, there were 7 people in the cabinet who had started their working life at the coalface in a mine, right?
In 1945.
1945, okay.
Wow.
As recently as the 1980s, certainly the Labour Party, to an extent the Conservative Party, the Conservative Party probably would have had a garagiste wing, which is people who started by, buying a garage. In the Labour Party, it would be much more likely they'd come through the union education system. But I think it was something like 18, 19, 20% of MPs only 20 years ago or 25 years ago had started their working life in a manual position.
Okay, so we forget that most politicians
the
today...
whole higher education system has created a racket.
I mean,
the higher education system exists to preserve middle-class privilege and to seek to solidify middle-class advantage.
Okay.
By writing the rules for success. The rules of the game are written in a way that middle-class people are uniquely well placed to play the game.
Middle class and upper middle class.
Yeah, and so
but we're in a democracy, so you have to relate to the common man, or you won't get elected.
And in fairness, of course, one interesting thing about America is that what we forgot about Hillary, right, is that I was watching occasionally for reasons of slightly perhaps unhealthy. I'm a total Reaganophile in that, as a guy who, I mean, somehow knew how to present himself, speak, etc.
Back to what you
that
said,
kind
right?
of all shucks humility.
Better
thing
to have a
which
leader
jumped in.
than an administrator.
And the extraordinary thing about Reagan, I watched him appear for Roy Acuff's, I think it's his 90th birthday at the Grand Ole Opry in Nashville. And he comes in a white suit. The way he does it is so brilliant. And then, of course, YouTube being YouTube, it starts playing me Reagan porn, essentially. And you see Reagan, okay, George W., right? When he had a bit of spare time, he went to Texas to be honest, okay, he was the president of the United States. He had some sort of ranch in Texas, which, to be honest, if you gave it to me, I'm not even sure I'd even go there. Right? I mean, he was kind of clearing brush and scrub. Reagan, of course, and Nancy were riding around in horses. They had a kind of pickup truck.
In California.
Virtually every... Clinton had, for all his kind of cunning, he had that common touch. You can imagine Clinton sneaking off to a KFC, can't you, right?
Yeah, he used to go to McDonald's with his running crew. CIA runners, they would go to McDonald's.
So they'd all go there.
Right.
Now, the interesting thing is that nearly every American president of the last, I suppose George H.W. Bush was the one exception in that, didn't really know how to fake or genuinely reflect that part of the American, which is, if you're going to be an American president, that's fine, but you've got to be 25% regular guy in some way.
Okay, and Boris ticks that box.
Well, where he ticks that box weirdly, although he's an old Etonian classicist and grotesque philanderer, etc., etc. The philandering is, by the way, interesting, and I'll come to that in a second.
Does that also make you like the common man?
Well, it also is a bit silverback, isn't it, in a way?
Yeah, I mean, Trump's doing the Stormy Daniels porn star thing, and no one cares. Might help him.
Of course, it is fair to remember that if you think about it, okay, to most people in the United States and the UK, certainly to most males, okay, the reaction to sudden wealth of Hugh Hefner makes much more sense than the reaction to sudden wealth of Mark Zuckerberg, doesn't it?
Okay, explain that.
Okay, well, a lot of people, if you said to them, what would you do if you had loads and loads of money suddenly? Okay, the answer basically, I live in a massive mansion in California surrounded by supermodels in bikinis, is to some extent a more normal reaction. And if we look at history, we read Petronius, we go back to the Roman emperors and so on. You know, that's kind of what powerful people do. They don't go to a software company and spend the time staring at a bloody screen.
And then take all the money and give it away.
So having your own plane, I have to admit this, okay, there is one thing, having a plane with your own name on it, that's the last thing on my bucket list, which I have to say. Sneakily, I shouldn't really admit this.
You don't have that with the Ogilvy plane?
No. But I mean, having a plane with Sutherland down the side, you've got to agree. Okay, that would be. I get slight envy of big haulage firms, don't you? Because there is a firm called Sutherland, which is a Caithness-based. That's where we're from. Okay. Caithness-based haulage firm, which I think takes things down to Smithfield Market. It's a meat haulage firm. And every now and then you see one of these massive kind of 18-wheelers with Sutherland in 18-foot high letters down the side. You go, fucking cool.
You get excited about that.
Even if you weren't making any money.
So there's something about Trump that does appeal to that common man.
Well, I mean, it is kind of like. I mean, it's always worth remembering at Oxbridge that you had Boris will know this very well. You had porters at Oxbridge, and the general thing of the porters, and to some extent the bed makers, okay, was they actually loved the boozers and the philanderers and despised the academics. to a great extent.
Because they were more like them.
Because it seemed
They had a human
much,
side.
It was a more natural reaction to privilege in many ways, which is to take advantage of it and to enjoy it, than to spend your whole time in a library mugging up on the Delian Confederacy or something, you know. And so...
and people don't apologize for it these days.
The one thing about Boris,
Trump doesn't.
I don't think I actually like him very much. I'm being really candid here. But the vital trick in marketing is if you can't put yourself in other people's shoes, you might as well pack up and go home, you know. Particularly as the real problem with marketing isn't just that it's very, very urban and London-centric. It's also... The problem with London is you're very homogeneous in terms of the age group and social group with which you hang out.
Right.
As soon as you move to suburbia, your next door neighbours are 65, you know, you have kids, you know, you have parents at the school who are all drawn from a different milieu to some extent, okay? But in London, it's possible to have a kind of social circle which, in terms of age group and socioeconomic group, are barely a cigarette paper apart from each other. And so it's not difficult to put yourself in the shoes of anybody else going, essentially, I can imagine myself having a pint with Boris, right? Whereas I can't really imagine myself hanging out at a KFC with Hillary Clinton, for example.
Okay.
And so those kind of qualities are at least interesting. The other thing is, of course, that you have the fact that all politicians are in complete thrall to neoliberal economics. I mean, I'm not including Corbyn and the far left in this, and I'm not including more eccentric people on the right. There's some very interesting thinkers on the right who also question this. But the problem with the neoliberal economics, which is essentially the function of government is to make the country economically more efficient, okay, is first of all, of course, we don't actually appreciate efficiency that much because we're not conscious of what we wouldn't have if it were less efficient. Okay, so that's a very simple thing. Okay, I'm sure that to some extent neoliberal economics has given me the, the Kindle or the whatever it might be. Maybe it's given me that hi-fi thing at a price which is, I don't know, 10% lower than I would have otherwise paid. But A, I might have paid the higher price anyway. B, I'm not really conscious of things that, if that thing didn't exist, I wouldn't really miss not having it. Okay.
Understood.
But the second thing is that neoliberal economics is a bit like being married to an accountant, which is you have quite a nice car, but you never use it to go anywhere interesting. And I think neoliberal economics fell into that trap, which is that it's so deficient in terms of meaning and motivation that only the nerdiest people, broadly speaking, only males, I think. It's one of the reasons I think conventional economics becomes a very, very male study as well, is you've almost got to be somewhere on the spectrum to actually regard that as a motivating force in your life. And so what it did is it created in politics a kind of vacuum for leadership, meaning... Now, I've said, I'm basically small c, possibly large c conservative at times. And one of the things I have said is we have to have some sort of aim like, okay, let's get to a 4-day week. Fantastic MP for Faversham, who's put a Conservative MP, who's put in a proposal. It was a 10-minute bill.
Why is that important, 4-day week?
Because we have totally failed to use technology to rethink patterns of working behaviour. One of the big problems is, okay, here's a classic case of path dependency. Now, if this seems a bit anti-feminist, bear with me because I got the whole point from Faye Weldon, okay, which is when the two-income household first became possible, it was an extraordinary act of liberation because women were free to work if they chose to do so, okay? Households that would rather have money than leisure could effectively have two people in the workforce, and therefore they could acquire goods at a rapider pace before they perhaps had children, okay? Then what happened is it became the norm, and the two-income family went from being an option to being compulsory because you couldn't afford a house unless you had that. And so that brought with it what you might call an increase in wealth, but a decrease in freedom. And so the typical married household with children has essentially gained not much economically because house prices have simply gone up pro rata, okay? They've lost 35 hours or 40 hours of discretionary time a week, which, now, I don't think we need all 40 of those hours. I think we have labour-saving appliances, which mean we might need 15 or 20. The extent to which childbearing disproportionately hurts female careers could also be solved if, as this fantastic MP proposes, that flexible working should be a default in all advertised jobs, and you'd have to give a reason why the job wasn't flexible. So instead of making flexible working an option, jobs are flexible by default unless they're not.
Okay.
And she's a very astute behavioral scientist. I've met her and she's brilliant. I'm kicking myself, I can't remember her name.
And this is, again, trading that income for the leisure that you said earlier that actually has more value.
America doesn't have a mechanism by which you could choose to earn a bit less money and have a lot more leisure. Now, just to give an example, you could double your holiday, your vacation allowance from 2 weeks to 4 at the cost of 4% of salary.
Yeah.
My hunch would be if given the freedom, more than 50% of Americans would do it. Why don't they do it? Because if you were the first person to go into your boss and say, I want 4 weeks vacation, it looks like you're not committed.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's something that has to be mandated because if you don't mandate it, essentially no one will ever put the bell on the cat.
Okay. Now, that's interesting.
And I also think, by the way, America would probably be richer if they did this. Now, this sounds strange, but if you think about it, money spent in leisure time is much more labour intensive and is spent locally. So I would argue that Americans probably have too many goods and too few hours in which to enjoy them.
Right, and then if they spent those, that it would be through the leisure
that actually
activities,
you'd probably boost the economy
wealthier.
more. I find, by the
Okay.
way, I go on holiday to the United States, and one of the reasons is that you get so little bloody vacation that even in peak times of the year, tourist attractions like the Grand Canyon. So we first went to the Grand Canyon completely out of season, okay, and we basically just parked next to the canyon and we looked at it, okay. The next time we went, it was with my children, so it had to be in the school holidays, so I think it was July or August. And we actually ended up in overflow car park C and had to walk a small way to the canyon, right? Now, if the Grand Canyon were in Spain, okay, in July and August, you wouldn't be able to get within 20 miles of it for people gawping at it. But you get so little vacation time that the only people who are going to see it, typically what it would be an American whose company has one of those conferences that ends on a Friday in Scottsdale. And because the American
I see your
conference
point.
industry is basically the American holiday industry in disguise.
So America needs to try to prioritize the spending versus the wealth
The interesting thing is,
versus the leisure.
wealth is to some extent the choices you can make with it. Okay,
Correct.
Wealth only increases if it increases the meaningful choices you can make.
Correct.
One of the reasons the very rich are often quite poor is if they're trapped in the status framework of other very rich people, they end up doing totally mindless and stupid things simply to compete. Which, this is why actually, one thing about Boris isn't really a genuine aristocrat, though he acts like one. One interesting thing I always think is, people who know how to spend their money are the very poor and very posh, not the very rich. The reason for the very posh know how to spend their money is they don't give a shit what anyone else thinks, okay? And the very poor can't afford to engage in senseless signalling activities, so they tend to spend their money on things that are actually fun. Right?
Yeah, that's well
Okay.
said.
Now, the middle class, 90% of middle class activity is effectively signalling how middle class you are to other middle class people, which both prevents you from doing things which are meaningfully enjoyable, like having an enormous television. Have you noticed this in Britain? This weird social thing which is it's considered classy either not to have a television or to have a small, modest television. No. Have a fucking huge television. It's great, right? Okay. Secondly, my less posh neighbours are able to have a hot tub in the garden. I have to say, I think a hot tub would be fantastic, right? Now, my guess is, if you're a kind of upper middle class American, you can't really have a hot tub. Is that fair?
Oh, you mean because it's too lowbrow?
It's a bit
yeah, you'd have to
vulgar.
call it something else,
You'd
like
have
a spa.
you'd have to exactly. No, you'd have to make it Japanese, wouldn't you? And you'd have to make it out of teak or something like that, and then you could just about get away with it. But
So
actually,
most of our behavior in our life is based on how we compete with other people and the perception.
and actually, that is an extraordinary waste of wealth because you're essentially allowing your preferences to be defined by other people.
Right, which lowers your happiness and engagement.
I'll give you an example, by the way, of indoctrination in this area, which is my wife occasionally gets those strange magazines like House and Garden, and I always look through the houses and go, but hold on, there isn't a single electrical device in any of these photographs. There isn't a radio, there isn't a hi-fi, there isn't a Bluetooth speaker, there isn't a television. Okay. Who the hell wants to spend like 400,000 quid on bloody Farrow and Ball? They got no telly. Okay. And so I met someone who worked for House and Garden. I go, where are the fucking tellies? They said, oh, we take all that out before we photograph the house. So there are a whole load of females who are basically being fed a lie that the good life consists of having artfully arranged pot plants and no large screen TV. And it's entirely a kind of aesthetic myth that is essentially being fed to people. But that's crap, isn't it? Why would you not want a huge TV? It's insane.
Spoken like a true man.
Yeah.
Let me ask you about Brexit, because it's on everyone's mind. And there was a Channel 4 doc with Cumberbatch about talking about the marketing manipulation that happened with that. I'm curious on your thoughts, the way that you see that the vote actually happened, the way that was done marketing-wise to people all around the country, and what it means to people now and the perception of it versus a reality.
I'm in a very strange position here because I'm genuinely not that bothered.
Right.
Which
Okay,
almost
that's
puts me in this weird pervy minority in that I voted Remain fairly narrowly. I think the EU is probably net beneficial, or I think it's a good idea which is very badly executed. I mean, I became a bit more levery when these three new Commission presidents emerged about 3 weeks ago through no kind of democratic process at all. Okay, they're a bunch of failed politicians from other countries who are given this kind of extraordinary position of power, and essentially it's decided behind closed doors. There's a significant democratic deficit. There's also a significant accountability deficit in that, broadly speaking, you want decisions that affect people to be taken in close proximity to the people who are affected. And I think that I also think that the homogenization, which is something, economists, for example, and business people have an absolute obsession with the efficiency gains from scale, which I think are actually questionable. And the reason is that when you gain in scale, you tend to lose in diversity. Now, I can't buy, really, a Citroën 2CV anymore because as the car industry has gained in scale, it's also lost what you might call the localized eccentricity and variety that it used to possess. And, increasingly cars look like other cars to a great extent. And okay, I mean, maybe the electric car will lead to an extraordinary proliferation of boutique car makers. I mean, we can only hope. That arguably it might bring back the coach builder, because essentially, if you think about it, early Rolls Royces were just engine chassis, and you parked it onto Mulliner Park Ward, and they did the bodywork. And an electric car, when you think about it, is so goddamn essentially all the moving parts. It's a roller skate with a battery and a bit of software. So the ability to actually build interesting vehicles on that platform strikes me as quite exciting. But anyway, so let me get back to Brexit and this. I thought Project Fear was a lie. I thought the extent to which they exaggerated the problems was also dishonest.
Project Fear was the campaign.
The Remainers made a terrible mistake, which is they turned Project Fear into Project Threat. Instead of saying there are significant disadvantages to leaving, they talked essentially about the fact that we can't possibly leave. It's impossible, which made then leavers think, well, hold on, you shouldn't have got us into this inescapable position in the first place, because the EU is patently a shapeshifter. It's a political project when it suits it. It's an economic project when it suits it, and you can't endlessly make people make political concessions in return for putative economic gains, because ultimately you end up completely trapped.
Okay.
I don't think the EU should have acquired a flag. I don't think it should have acquired an anthem, by the way. I think those were terrible mistakes, because you could do loads of things. You can have a logo. You can have loads and loads of things. NATO's got a flag, admittedly. But I think it's a mistake to essentially try and take on the trappings of a state, because it shouldn't be that yet.
Okay.
50 years' time, 60 years. There is a natural pace. There's a natural pace of change. The EU, unfortunately, by dint of its dysfunctional decision making, if you think about it, it's made some universally bad decisions. I mean, the extraordinary diesel cheating crisis, the euro itself is a terrible mistake. Freedom of movement shouldn't have been introduced across the board simultaneously. Okay, simply because if you've got any kind of interest in complex systems, you realise that what is good, okay, and generally freedom of movement would bring ultimately economic goods, but you can't get from state A to state B without the gains. If you try and move from the first state to the second too quickly, okay, the gains become incredibly uneven. And the gains from freedom of movement were extraordinarily uneven. If you think about it, Britain's at a disadvantage in a weird way because we speak English. So there are more British-born people working in Australia than there are British-born people working outside the UK in the EU.
Okay.
That surprises everybody when they hear it. Okay, so the very language thing makes... Okay, so most people who have been brought up on American, British films, etc., and can speak English, 90% as well as I can come over to Britain. There's a whole range of jobs they can do. If I moved to Warsaw, I'd be sweeping the streets, right? Because all my skills are entirely linguistically dependent, and I don't speak Polish.
Right, so that transfer doesn't go the other way.
That transfer is highly uneven.
Okay.
If you think about it, okay, let's imagine you had washing machines where all French-made washing machines would work with a British plug, but to make a British-made washing machine work in France, you had to install a £100 inverter, okay? That would not be an even competitive situation for washing machine manufacturers. British washing machine manufacturers would be at a disadvantage. If you replace the £100 voltage inverter with learning the language of the local country, that asymmetry exists in terms of freedom of movement if you're an English-speaking country to begin with.
Okay, that makes sense. So where do we go from here with Brexit? How do you...
So my point is, I'm totally even-handed. I would probably have preferred that we stayed. Having taken the vote, we have to leave because democracy is more important than 1% GDP growth. And to adhere to the principle of you voted, this is what you want. It's extremely good for the middle class to have to occasionally do something that they don't like because it hasn't happened to them for 25 years. Basically 20 middle-class urban people pretty much get to design the world they want. It's hardly unhealthy for them occasionally to have to do something that makes them uncomfortable.
Which is what's happening right now.
Which is what's happening.
They kind of have to get used to it.
The other thing that makes me uncomfortable is that the reaction of the EU to the Leave vote, to some extent, cemented the Leave vote. Because there's a very simple thing, okay? Everybody talks about the huge economic problems of trade. Nobody talks really very much about the defence or political disadvantages of leaving. Not much, because probably they suspect there aren't many, to be absolutely honest. There would be if you were Ireland or you were Belgium, okay? But if you're the fifth largest economy or sixth largest economy in the world, you can kind of do that shit yourself, okay? The problem with this economic thing is that everybody in business knows, if you quiz them, that if you put 50 businessmen in a room, they could solve the Brexit thing in an afternoon. Okay, you'd say, okay, fair enough that that Britain pays some duties on certain products. We patently need special treatment for the free movement of agricultural goods, foodstuffs, aerospace, and automotive parts. There are a few select industries which were disproportionately hit if we're not careful. We need to basically preserve those. We need a solution which is to some extent a cosmetic solution in Ireland, which is provided the border checks don't happen at the border. Okay. Now, it's worth remembering there are customs and border checks within the United States. Okay. If you drive from Vegas to California, there's an agricultural thing that checks you're not, carrying weird animals or something, or plants with you, right?
Yeah, and maybe checks that you don't look like you're from Mexico. They do a bit of both there.
So you think there's a bit of secret immigration?
I think there is. I've been through that check a few times. So, okay, I think I understand what you're saying. You talk about this thing called the placebo effect in your book.
Well, the interesting thing is it's dishonest, really, What is dishonest is it's not really an economic problem. The reason Brexit's been made difficult is the politics of the EU, which is it cannot allow us to be seen to leave without suffering.
Right. Okay. And that's what's happening now.
That's a political problem. If you're a business person, you could say, and I talked, by the way, there are quite a lot of Levy business people, by the way, out there. We shouldn't forget that. It's worth remembering that Dyson is probably a lever, asking why, because the lobbying business, which in Britain is recent and in the United States I think is catastrophic, the influence that business has over democracy. If you want to know why Dyson's a huge Eurosceptic, it's probably because the German vacuum cleaner industry tried to stitch him up. Because in setting the standards for vacuum cleaners, they tried to make the test, does this sound familiar? Okay, only be performed on empty vacuum cleaners.
Okay.
So the efficiency gains of a Dyson, which doesn't lose suction because of its vortices, okay, would not then be essentially detectable in the test.
Okay, I get that.
Because you basically hoover up air.
Let me move on from Brexit, and let me talk about a couple things in this book.
That is a huge stitch-up. Okay?
Yeah, it is.
We should be hugely uncomfortable about an organization where that kind of thing can happen.
Okay. You talk about the book, a thing called the placebo effect. What does that mean, and what should we understand that from a marketing perspective, where, it's a real psychological effect of what we're being sold and what's happening. What does that mean?
So, I mean, essentially, you can take the idea of the placebo and you can define that more broadly or more narrowly as you choose. By the way, I'm not sure, I ought to be very clear about this, I'm not sure about evidence for placebos that they actually cure things. What I am confident is evidence of placebos where the problem itself is something that's perceptual, for example, pain or discomfort. I'm absolutely clear that placebo and the placebo effect can be magnified to remove what you might call the psychological side effects of certain conditions. Okay? And there are people who go further, who say that actually, I mean, it seems weirdly that you can cure obesity by giving people a fake gastric band operation. Which, when you think about it, so in other words, they've had cases where the operation hasn't gone ahead because of some problem, and yet the person loses weight anyway. Now, so patently, there's a part of the human endocrine system which is psychologically driven. And the theory around the placebo effect is this, that essentially, okay, we have to conserve, in the evolutionary environment, we had to conserve our resources very carefully. And one of the things is a massive response to illness or disease, A, is extraordinarily costly in terms of resources, and B, may actually immobilize you, which means you can't escape from predators. Okay, so most of the unpleasant side effects of a cold or flu are actually the body's attempt to actually rid the body of flu by increasing your temperature and so forth. So interestingly, the immune response is what creates the discomfort. Now, obviously the body has to limit that immune response because something that completely immobilized you might have a huge risk attached in evolutionary terms. And there's an argument that we're ill more often in the winter than we are in the summer because the body has a more conservative use of resources to fight infection in the winter, where you might starve to death or where you might freeze to death overnight. Whereas in the summer, it's calibrated to an environment where food is more abundant and where the requirement of energy to actually just fight cold is reduced. Okay, so the argument is, there is an interesting experiment, which is if you convince hamsters or guinea pigs or something, by changing the lighting, if you convince them that it's summer, they seem to get ill less and mount a more effective immune response against any illnesses you give them. Simply because their brain stroke internal immune mechanism effectively is thinking that it's summer. Now, a placebo is equivalent to making you think it's summer. It creates the conditions in which your body goes, okay, I can actually turn this dial up to 9 now because I'm in bed, people are looking after me, they're bringing me soup. I have a wise shaman with a white coat, also known as a doctor, who is ministering to me reassuring kind of pills. Given these conditions, now is a really good moment to turn the dial up on my immune response.
Gotcha, and that's how that works.
Now, that's the narrow medical definition of a placebo. But people, including Nicholas Humphrey, the Cambridge psychologist, say there are what he calls placebos in the wild, or collective placebos. So if you think about it, you want a group of soldiers to be brave and to make sacrifices on behalf of each other. What you do is you use, now if you think about it, there are parts of your body you can control, or at least over which you have the illusion of conscious control, like moving my hand up and down. Then there are parts of my body, my heart rate, for example, or my pupils, which I can control obliquely but can't control directly. I can meditate and bring my heart rate down. I can go jogging and bring my heart rate up. I can dilate my pupils by moving into a dark room or weirdly looking at pornography. I don't know why that works, but go figure. Okay, that for some reason causes your pupils to dilate. Okay, now, interestingly, the Germans interestingly have a thing called Bettaugen, which means bedroom eyes, which must be somehow linked to that. That's in a state of arousal, people's eyes grow bigger. But the interesting thing there is that you can control those things obliquely, but you can't control them directly. I can't say, I'm going to be brave today, okay? I can't say, pupils dilate to by, 15%. Okay. But what I can do is if I create an environment in which it's easy and natural to be brave, you all march together, you call yourselves brothers in arms, you all live together. If you think about soldiery, they tend to be billeted together. They're very much in close proximity. They're taught to almost see each other as brothers and as a family. They have enormous symbols. You use trumpets and music and drums, which seem to make people braver. You have symbols, banners, regimental flags, all the panoply of things which tend to create unity in human beings and make them, to borrow the words of Jonathan Haidt, a bit more ant and a bit less chimp. So we become then much more of a collective force and less of an individualist force. Okay. I think special forces soldiers are probably different. I think in that case with special forces soldiers, you have people who are not quite, to say psychopath or sociopath is unfair because people aren't completely psychopathic. But special forces soldiers seem to have the very weird quality, which is they jump out of a helicopter while being shot at and they're not frightened.
Right. Okay. The back of this book says to be brilliant, you have to be irrational. And what are you trying to say by that?
What I'm saying is that
strong statements here.
Since 90% of remaining human problems aren't really problems of physics, they're problems of psychology. Okay. Everything gets defined as an economic problem or as a physical problem. How do we make trains faster? How do we reduce income inequality? Okay. Now, income inequality is a weird one because to some extent, is it actually a problem? In other words, if everybody is reasonably well fed, dressed, rested, the problem is actually a psychological one, which is it makes us feel uncomfortable in some way.
Right.
Now, so when you're trying to solve a psychological problem, using the mathematical tools and the simple, straightforward models of Newtonian physics, as it were, patently doesn't apply because the way we perceive things isn't objective. Okay, right. So the way in which you, for example, the way in which you get people to behave in a particular way or feel in a particular way may be extremely oblique. Just as how do you make trains faster? You put a sign on the platform. That doesn't actually make the train faster. It makes the wait less painful, but that's equivalent to making trains more frequent, making the wait less painful.
Right.
Okay?
And you say this like the problem with logic is it kills off magic. That's the way of you seeing this.
Well, the great thing is that psychological problems can sometimes be solved magically, whereas physical problems can't.
Right.
Okay? So there's no such thing as a free lunch, is the economist's attempt to recreate the second law of thermodynamics for the social sciences.
Yes. That was repeated to me a lot in business school. No free lunch.
No free lunch. But actually, of course, psychologically, there is a free lunch.
There is.
If someone buys me lunch, I feel differently about them and about the lunch than if they made me go Dutch or made me pay. Okay?
And you have other unexpected things like dare to be trivial. If there were a logical answer, we would have
once you escape the Newtonian trap butterfly effects become possible. You can add a word and change a human reaction. Okay, so I've got a great friend, Paul Craven, who's a very, very good magician, and also spent many years in finance. And he said the single best trick I ever learned in business is that when you want to ask someone a favor, most people say, "I need you to do me a favor," or "Sorry to dump this on you, but," or "I'm sorry, but I'm absolutely snowed under and I need you to do this for me." He said, if you phrase that same thing as, "I wonder if you can help me." In other words, you're not certain they can help you, but you're asking them a question where they will gain considerably in status and in estimation if they can answer yes. There, you've actually created a volunteer rather than press-ganged a recruit.
Okay.
And so the entire approach they will have towards performing that task will have been rendered completely different simply because of the tone of voice and the wording in which they've been asked to do it.
Right.
Okay, now that's really important because, as I said, okay, if you don't believe me, if you had reframed the student loan as a graduate tax, the entire reaction to it would have been totally different. I personally believe, my politics are weird, as you're probably starting to gather, okay? I personally believe we should have inheritance tax. I think the person who should be taxed should be the recipient, okay? It shouldn't be taxed at the point of death, it should be taxed at the point of receipt, encouraging people to spread their money more widely. Okay, but once people started calling the inheritance tax a death tax, okay, it was kind of doomed. Whereas if you just said, it seems to me ridiculous that someone should say, well, if you go out to work as a teacher for a year and you happen to have made it to headmaster and you get promoted or a pay rise, that pay rise as a headmaster of a school is taxed at 40%. Okay, but if your dad dies and he happens to own a large house in the country, you get £300,000 tax-free. That seems to me utterly fucking ridiculous.
Right.
Because it's just that actually inheriting money is somehow something to be incentivized more than actually earning it. Now, Adam Smith, by the way, was in favour of large inheritance taxes, as is Warren Buffett.
Let me ask you a couple of these other questions. A flower is simply a weed with an advertising budget. What does that mean, Rory?
Signalling is often necessary in a economics doesn't understand. Well, economics came up with, in part, the concept of signalling, although partly borrowed it from biology. But in many cases, it is necessary. And my point is that advertising is 20 million years old. And pollinated flowers have been kicking around for at least 20 million years. And in order to convince a bee that it is worth investigating, you have to actually advertise yourself. And the extent to which you spend money on petals is proof of your confidence in the long-term value of what you have to offer. So people use advertising as a heuristic for knowing whom to trust.
Okay, that's really good. Don't design for average.
No, innovation tends to happen around the edges. So if you design for the very middle of a market, you end up in an overcrowded field. The people who successfully innovate are the people who actually, I'll give you a lovely example of this. BT developed a phone with huge buttons intended for people who are basically blind.
Yeah, I remember.
Now, the thing to remember is designing for the disabled is a really good philosophy because most of us are kind of disabled a lot of the time. So if you're standing on a train, you lose the use of one arm because you've got to hold on to something. It's now mandated that you have door handles rather than door knobs in buildings so that people with no hands can open the door with an elbow. Now, actually, someone carrying 2 mugs of tea effectively has no hands. So looking at people and designing for people under particular constraints, or, for example, frequent users are often very, very different. So 10 people who buy your product 100 times a year are very different from 100 people who buy your product 10 times a year. And that's why you need Amazon Prime, okay? So Amazon Prime is a classic example of not designing for average, because Amazon Prime is the realization that, and I think interestingly, Bezos was already a billionaire when he introduced Amazon Prime.
I think so.
And he came across huge opposition within the organization. But I think his point was very simple. He probably felt, even if you're a billionaire, okay, 10 people don't mind paying £3 for delivery once a month. No one, however rich, is really going to be happy paying £3 to delivery 10 times a month. And therefore, if you want to have frequent customers, you have to have some mechanism where they can pay for all the delivery in one shot.
Okay, and that was the outer edge.
Yeah.
This one I don't understand. The opposite of a good idea can also be a good idea.
Hugely important, because by modeling social science on physics, we think that being scientific means being like your high school science class, where there was a right answer and a wrong answer, and you could go 3.7, tick. Anything that wasn't 3.7 was wrong, right? In marketing, 1, the rules of the game aren't constant. 2, you can rewrite them. 3, by changing the context, you can change what good means. So, to give you an example, not far from here, there used to be a restaurant in Chinatown called Wong Ki. Do you remember it?
No.
It was a Chinese restaurant in Chinatown, famous for being the rudest restaurant in London. Now,
Okay.
normally,
No, I think I've heard
being
of it.
rude in a restaurant is a bad idea. Okay, just as, for example, saying that gravity acts upwards in physics means you'll make some really dumb decisions. But if you actually make your rudeness part of your proposition and people expect it in advance, then weirdly being rude in a restaurant can be a benefit, not a cost.
So that means it's another good idea.
Yeah, so
It's
Red
the
Bull.
opposite.
Red Bull's a classic example. It's the opposite of Coke. It tastes disgusting, comes in a tiny can. In all those respects, you can take the opposite of something and people like it. I would argue, for example, if you take hotel check-in, a really, really smooth automated hotel check-in is great. You know, where I just take my mobile phone up to room 307 and open the door. I think that was really cool. I also think that the Mandarin Hotel in Hong Kong, where someone walks you up to your room and makes you a cup of tea and a pot of tea in your room while you fill in the check-in forms, that's also a great form of hotel check-in.
Right.
What isn't good is the middle.
Yeah.
As I also often say, there's a bargain and there's an extravagant treat. Okay? We don't get an endorphin rush from mid-market retail. The Henry is a great vacuum cleaner. The Dyson is a great vacuum cleaner. Okay?
Yeah, no, understood. That's
So,
well said.
so the idea that we're trying to optimize something is fundamentally mistaken, and therefore we're using the wrong maths and the wrong mindset in making marketing decisions if we assume only that our job is to be the best at something. And if we define ourselves by our competitors, we'll be even worse, because we're trying to be better at something that a lot of people are already good at. What's the point of doing that? Okay.
Yeah.
Now, the person who understands this best in the business world, if you want to read a business book, and mine is only partly a business book, Peter Thiel, or Thiel, I know Americans pronounce German words in a weird way, but
0 to 1.
It's 0 to 1 is a great, great book. He understands this stuff absolutely brilliantly. You know, your purpose is not to be a great competitor. Your purpose is to create a kind of mental monopoly in some space.
Right.
It's to create a monopoly, essentially, so that you have monopoly pricing power and actually can operate like a great business can and innovate and take long-term decisions. The second you're trying to be competitive, to be honest, the future health of your business is already in doubt, because you're driven by short-termism and the whims of the market.
Yeah, that's really powerful. Don't be dare to be trivial. Rule number 10.
Yeah, the way to solve a problem may be surprisingly trivial and silly. And our attempts in business to make ourselves look serious and important by always talking about higher order things we've read in The Economist, okay, may actually make us stupid. What you need to do is change. Sometimes all you need to do is do a very small butterfly effect change, and actually you can. But by the way, the opposite is also true. That big inputs can have small effects. Small inputs can have big effects. That's why human behaviour, i.e., complex behaviour, isn't like high school science.
Okay. If there were a logical answer, we would have found it. What does that mean?
That means that by and large, the remaining problems tend to be problems that are logic proof. This isn't the Middle Ages. There were a lot of problems in the Middle Ages which hadn't been solved because no one had brought a logical approach to them.
Correct.
In many respects, there are certain inventions which are weirdly late to emerge. Okay? But I would argue in the modern age, replete as it is with management consultants and economists and hyper-rational politicians, for that matter, the problems that actually persist are likely to be those problems which can't be solved by what you might call direct, non-oblique, non-creative, proportionate intervention.
Right. And on that same note, you have one rule, rule number 8, test counterintuitive things only because no one else will.
Yeah, because information that you know and everybody else doesn't know is much more valuable in creating a kind of monopoly than information that everybody knows.
Okay. All right. So this is really about going against the grain. Number 6, the problem with logic is it kills off magic.
Definition of trying to make something scientific is the first assumption of a science is that magic is impossible. Absolutely true in physics, not true in psychology. You can solve, there is magic possible in psychology. You can make something worth 10 times as much money, essentially, simply by tweaking with the brain, not the thing itself.
Right, and we see this all the time with products and videos going viral and all these weird things that happen not scientifically, happen because of the brain and psychology. What's your business like these days? Because you mentioned AI a few times, and we know digital economy, it's become very numbers driven, Facebook ads and YouTube ads and metrics, and yet you sit on top of a lot of that and think, wait a second, guys, we've gotten too much into the numbers. We've gotten too logical. Is that what I'm hearing from you?
I'm never hostile to numbers. I'm slightly hostile to the bad use of numbers, and I'm very hostile to numbers that make decisions without any human intervention or oversight. The Boeing 737 MAX, that it might be a case in point, okay? Which is that I don't, by the way, I don't believe you should have speed cameras. Or rather, I think at the very least, the speed camera should send back a video to a human operator, okay, of the 20 seconds before the speeding offence and the 20 seconds after the speeding offence to see in which context you are actually breaking the speed limit. Because there are cases where, secondly, I think that speed cameras or bus lane cameras, which are disproportionately profitable, okay, should be assigned. First of all, if you have a speed camera that's disproportionately catching a lot of people speeding, which, by the way, that Lib Dem politician, you remember on the M11, he was done for driving back from Stansted and breaking the speed limit.
Okay.
That speed camera raises about 10 times as much money as any other speed camera in Essex. What that suggests to me, as a complexity scientist, is that, sorry mate, what you got there is a problem with signage and road design, not a problem with speeding.
Right.
Because if one speed camera catches people disproportionately to that extent, what it actually suggests, I can tell you exactly what happens, right? Okay? You're tooling down the M11 at, let's be realistic, okay, 78 miles an hour, because it's 1 o'clock in the morning, okay, or he was coming back from Stansted pretty late.
Okay, but that's a specific road in a specific situation.
Specifically, no. But then suddenly you come across a sign that says 50. Now, in order to not be caught by the speed camera, you'd have to brake with a violence which would actually be dangerous to road users behind you and dangerous to yourself.
So bad design.
So that's bad design, right? Similarly, if you have a bus lane, as in a camera in South London, which I think makes something like £3 million a year for people, the reason for that is that in order to turn left, you have to turn into the bus lane at some point, because otherwise turning left is downright dangerous.
Sure.
That is not evidence where you should be punishing the individual, you should be punishing the road designer.
Okay. But what about with what you do at Ogilvy and all this information? I mean, 10 years from now, will it be much more AI? Will there be computers figuring these things out?
I'm totally happy with having AI. I think, by the way, in some cases, AI will be very creative, because I think AI will dare to be trivial because it doesn't have an idea of what trivia is. So weirdly, AI will quite often, I think, pick up the importance of butterflies. So AI also doesn't practice, one hopes, defensive decision-making. Where it becomes dangerous, however, is what becomes defensive decision-making, okay, is always doing what the AI says. Because you're much less likely to get sued for obeying the algorithm than you are if you use your own judgment. Right. So you may create an environment in which overriding AI becomes a very dangerous career move, and we've got to be careful of that. We've also got to be careful because AI and algorithms contain within them the inherent biases and prejudices of the designer.
Yeah.
So, for example, all train AI assumes you want to get to your destination as soon as possible. Until recently, I think they may have corrected this in response, I hope, to my article. You could be at Waterloo Station wanting to get to Bath. There could be a direct train to Bath leaving in 10 minutes. And your National Rail app would tell you to go to Paddington and catch a train there because it's 7 minutes faster, okay? Even though the train is twice the price and involves taking a tube, carrying your luggage up an escalator and doing all that, rather than merely boarding a direct Waterloo train to Bath. Okay, That's because someone has designed the algorithm to over-prioritize the importance of speed versus hassle and price.
Yeah.
In the case of airline algorithms, we're being so driven to choose by price that it will soon become completely impossible to introduce optional improvements to passenger experience in an aircraft because you'll fall below the fold in the search results. Okay? And therefore, essentially, air travel, if we're not careful, will become a race to the bottom where the natural human trade-off between quality and price will become distorted. In the case of Google Maps, the algorithm is designed by Californians. And Californians don't understand the idea of a journey where you drive to a station and catch a train. So if I ask Google Maps when I'm in Sevenoaks, get me into work, it goes, okay, do you want to go by car or do you want to go by public transport? Okay, now that's a very Californian. It doesn't switch to Spanish when I click public transport. That'd be the most Californian thing in the world, wouldn't it? It goes, hola, amigos, here's your pass. But it basically assumes that the only reason you want to use public transport is because you don't own a car. Now, anybody who lives outside the M25 knows the way to get to central London, unless it's like a quiet Sunday, is basically you drive to a station, you catch a train.
Right. Okay.
Okay.
Understood.
Okay. But this thing goes, okay, well, you can go by car and it takes you an hour and 25 minutes because you'll get stuck in traffic, or you can take a bus to the railway station, which means you'll have to walk for half a mile and then wait for 30 minutes for a bus, right? Now, both of those are based on a bollocks assumption that you can't mix car with train.
Okay. What's the biggest challenge facing Ogilvy in the next 10 years?
I think that the whole advertising industry has totally lost the plot, and that it has become obsessed with that part of advertising which is a media and targeting optimization process. And the creative industry, the creative agencies, essentially are guilty of a kind of Stockholm syndrome to the media agencies, where they think it's all about essentially optimization of something. I would argue something completely contrary, which is that efficiency and effectiveness in much marketing activity may be inversely correlated.
Inversely?
Absolutely inversely, that actually it's the part of advertising that's wasted is the part that works. To quote a paper written at the London Business School. Now, let me explain one possible reason for this, okay, is fame, okay? If you asked a teenager on Saturday night, why do you always go out on Saturday night? And they would answer something along these lines. They'd say, well, I might get lucky. You go, well, how are you going to get lucky? Well, I don't know, but, I might meet a girl, I might meet a boy, I might meet some mates, and we might have a great time. I might end up, I don't know, in a fight, I don't know, whatever the people want from Saturday night. But what they know is, they don't know how they're going to get lucky. What they do know is that if they stay home on Saturday night, they're not going to get lucky. Best that can happen is they watch quite a good film. Now, I would argue that a very, very strong justification for advertising is simply that if I'm famous, the likelihood that positive luck events happen to me goes up enormously. Okay, I can't say in advance what they're going to be. I can't say remotely in advance how I'm going to get lucky. It may be that because that my chief executive gets his call returned because people have heard of our company. It might be that someone really clever comes to us with a good idea because they've heard of our company. Everything that's good that ever happens to you happens because someone's heard of you, right? Okay?
Right.
And that fame is a great way of exploiting luck asymmetry, that far more good things happen to you if you're famous, with no increase in bad things, with one exception, which is if you get involved in a scandal, it's worse.
Okay.
So if you're a dishonest company, you don't want to be famous because it makes it much, much worse when you're caught out. But if you're basically a reputable company making a good product and you're not a dodgy drugs company killing people, it pays you to be famous because the positive asymmetries of interactions, the positive interactions that result vastly outweigh what is a really trivial downside.
Okay, and that's marketing, getting you famous.
Now, the need to say in advance how we're going to be successful reduces the number of ways in which you can be successful.
Okay.
because you've already defined in advance what success looks like. Well, why don't you just say, I want to be successful, I don't really care how. Now, I'll give you a fantastic example of this, right?
That's the problem with metrics, though. You're following one metric and you're saying, I want to do this.
By trying to make everything quantifiable, you're narrowing in advance the number of possibilities your company has to get lucky.
Okay.
Now, if you hold up the book for a second, right? Okay, that book is sort of a psychology book. I wrote it. I didn't write it just for advertising people. I'll be clear about that, because Jeremy Bullmore said the best books about advertising.
How do you get Nassim Taleb to put a quote like that on your book?
Well,
he's not exactly the easiest guy to nail down, and he doesn't actually say nice things about anybody.
We get on fine, actually, and I love the guy. The book would never have been written without Nassim Taleb, because his work in the Inserto is the classic work. I also admire people like Robert H. Frank, I mentioned earlier. Okay, those are people who are of enormous value, because if you read their books, you get thousands of things out of the books, but really you get one thing, which is, oh, so as well as looking at it like this, I could also look at it like that. And actually there is no context-free truth, really, okay? So the more ways in which you can look at something, the richer you are. Okay, now the crucial thing here, what happened with this book was, I was really lucky in meeting Nassim Taleb, to be honest, without whom I wouldn't have had the confidence to write the book. Nassim, by the way, I'm delighted to say that Nassim has bought 8 copies of the book or something for friends. Nice. So he patently likes it more than just returning a favour, which flatters me immensely, because I think he's a giant.
He said quite a lot. So he says it's a breakthrough book. Mother Reality makes sense in her own way. So Nassim Taleb says this is a breakthrough book. Mother Reality makes sense in her own way. She yields her secrets to practitioners, almost never to academics. I love this. Something psychologists, economists, and non-skin-in-the-game people, no matter what they say, are functionally unable to grasp. I thought that was good. So
just as 20% of bees, another very good book, Eric Beinhocker, The Origins of Wealth, by the way, is a really, really good book. The interesting thing there is that bees, a certain number of bees, disobey the waggle dance and go around at random. And the reason is they don't know what they're doing in advance. They're just trying to get lucky. I would argue that advertising serves that purpose. And with this book, what an extraordinary thing happened. I mean, I met Nassim, and Nassim liked the book, okay, which kind of helps. Something else happened as well, which is someone, I'm not quite sure who, but someone sent out a copy to Chris Evans. Now, okay, I didn't write it for the advertising industry, but I wrote it as a business book with also relevance to people interested in psychology. I never thought for a second, okay, if I'd sat down and said, okay, how do we promote this book? Let's get on the Chris Evans breakfast show, okay? He said, no, I don't think it's not that kind of book. Now, so happened, Chris interviews me. He happens to be in Cannes, happens to call me up. I happen to appear on the show, broadcast from Cannes. The following day, having read the book, Chris continues to go on about how much he likes the book, right? For about a week, the book was outselling The Hungry Little Caterpillar. It was outselling The Highway Code, okay? It was outselling Dan Brown. Okay, it was number 7 on Amazon. Right? It's insane, right? Okay, The Highway Code's bloody compulsory. Okay, now, and that's the hardback. Now, okay, it didn't last forever. I'll need some more good luck if I'm to get the thing into the Sunday Times bestseller list or whatever. Nonetheless, that was something which was a huge positive upside, which came, in a sense, as a result of indiscriminate promotion. If I'd only targeted the book to people working in, for example, behavioral science, okay, it's a very efficient way of promoting the book, because a very large proportion of those people would go on to actually buy the book. But it's actually an ineffective way of selling the book, because I'll never get lucky. The most that can ever happen to me is I get 100% penetration of the world's behavioral science community.
Yeah.
And so
that's an analogy for marketing.
The very idea of strategizing is the huge advantage of being a rich organization is presumably that you can afford to talk to lots of people, and then you hope you'll get better employees because you're famous, you'll get better ideas brought to you because you're famous. You don't need to pay your employees quite as much if you're a famous company, because they derive more status working for you.
Okay, so think about marketing from the
those are impossible to quantify. They're also impossible to promise and impossible to predict, but they are very, very valuable.
Okay, that's a very good point. Tell me about you. What's something that you do every day that is a non-negotiable for you? Maybe a way you create, or a way you wake up in the morning, or certain things that you do.
Every week I have to spend a day working from home, otherwise I go crazy. I have to spend, very strangely, I have to spend about an hour of the day staring into space.
Really?
You might call it meditation, but it isn't really, it's staring into space.
When do you do that? How do you do that?
Well, I like commuting. This is the honest thing, okay? Which is that, funnily enough, I'd always surmised this, and a friend of mine called Douglas McWilliams, who's a transport and specialist economist, so there's econometric data that supports this, that actually people prefer not to live too close in time to their workplace. That's why you move to Belsize Park from Shoreditch, you see.
Probably.
We like a bit of a mental buffer between work and home. And it's kind of like diver decompression, I guess. So one thing, this terrible thing, that business of the train journey staring into space is actually really important to me. I always go first class because I buy an off-peak first class, which Southeastern do, which is
It makes
great.
you feel good, much more than the value of the price of the ticket.
So yeah, no, absolutely right. So, and also it's but the second thing is it's very hard to describe. The staring time is really, really valuable. Just having that buffer in between home and work, and how would I describe it? So actually, my argument is that commute in a weird kind of way, and it's a terrible thing to say, okay, but you probably know this as well. When you're looking forward to that 45 minutes staring time on a train journey, let's say, if I'm on a platform and I see close to me on the platform the person I like the most in the whole of the world, with the possible exception of my wife, okay, genuinely, someone who's fantastic company, entertaining, charming, everything, my heart slightly sinks because I'm going to have to talk to them.
Right, yeah.
And that's a terrible thing to say because it makes you feel a bit of a bastard. But I think everybody who commutes feels the same way.
Because they want that quiet time to themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was like meditation before the East got here. English meditation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And of course, I wonder I think there's a bit of a gender divide there. If you think about course fishing, which is just staring with equipment, basically, isn't it?
Okay.
I mean, course fishing is basically just staring.
Right.
And you just have to buy some expensive equipment in order to have a reason to be staring. But basically it's staring.
And that's a male
thing.
thing.
And it's a very male thing. And there is some evidence in transportation which shows the same thing, which is that basically guys, okay, and this is when my wife always gets really disquieted because she goes, what are you thinking about? Genuinely, I'm not thinking about anything, And I think that our staring time is really, really vital.
Yeah, I think it's very powerful. Rory?
Open plan offices bother me for that reason because I think they make it difficult to stare.
Okay, yeah, you might have a point. Someone's always in your eye line. You can always hear what's going on.
Maybe what it is a slightly verbalizing, non-visual person. There may be an actual thing, which is that if you think about it, a huge percentage of your brain is processing speech, vision, etc., and the ability to turn that off has some value. I mean, there's often an argument, isn't there, that the real value of alcohol is it switches off your prefrontal cortex a bit, and you get to feel what it's like to be an animal.
Yeah, there's something
being
there.
pissed, you actually know what it's like to be an animal again. And now that is, I'm sure it's really, really bad neuroscience, but it's quite useful metaphor.
Yeah, that's very powerful. Rory, what if I asked about 5 of your friends and said, what is Rory's superpower? How does this man get the things that you get done? What would they say it is? What's the one quality?
It's also a weakness, which is distractibility. But actually, the ability to get distracted, I don't really have a sense of proportion. And I think that's weirdly useful because most people with a sense of proportion tend to look for solutions which are proportionate.
Sure, okay. And you'll get distracted and go off.
And I'll go, what if it's just all about this? And this may sound absurd. It's a huge advantage being 53 because generally, if you say something counterintuitive or silly when you're 23, you get ignored. At least when you're 53, I'm saying this to young people as something to look forward to, one of the few things to look forward to. Yeah. At least people have to give it 15 seconds consideration.
Well, it also helps with your CV.
Yeah, no, I guess.
But yeah, you're right.
Even then, I think it is an age thing.
I agree.
Because I think for some reason, there is that huge advantage that if you are 53 and you say something a bit weird, people will at least go, well, I wonder.
Yeah.
You know, yeah.
What was the best day of your life and the worst day of your life?
A day in a Qatari prison was pretty bad. I didn't like that.
When was that?
That was about 2 years ago, I guess, two and a bit years ago. I was vaping on a plane, and they didn't have a box for vaping on a plane. So they ticked the box and reported to the ground that I'd been smoking on a plane because vaping was so new, there wasn't a tick box for it. So I ended up essentially being banged up in a Doha prison for 24 hours. That was interesting, actually, because the worst part of it was the uncertainty. So if they just said, you're going to be in jail for 24 hours, then we're going to let you go. Okay. But what happened, it's like this Middle Eastern thing where nobody wants to give you bad news, you know that thing?
Okay.
And so they said, oh, don't worry, what we'll do is we'll just take you off the plane. And this, you know, if they just said, okay, it's 24 hours in jail, then you go. Oh, this is ridiculous, you can't do this. I go, okay, well, I can put up with 24 hours in jail. But what instead happens is they go, oh no, don't worry, you'll just come to here, you'll pay a small fine, and we'll put you on your plane to London. Oh, fine, it's fine, yeah. Okay, don't worry, all you need to do is sign some forms, and we'll take you to the plane. Yeah, great, that's fine, okay. You really do need to get a bit of a move on, because my plane is actually leaving in only an hour and a half, and I need to pay this fine and move on. And then they go, well, don't worry, if we don't get you on this plane, we'll get you on the plane in 2 hours' time. And okay, well, fine. And then suddenly I'm in the back of a bloody sort of SUV with two soldiers with rifles and two cops in the front, me in the middle between the two guys with rifles. It's a bit heavy, isn't it? You know, it's a bit weird. And then suddenly we drive out, and they go, hold on, where are we going? We're going to the airport, but the airport's behind us. And then eventually they say, it's a very weird cultural thing, this thing of not giving it to you straight. Eventually they say, no, you're not going to the airport, you're going to prison. Now at that point, I don't know, what the hell's going on here? Is this going to be a week? Is it going to be a month? But there was someone else in Sevenoaks who basically ended up banged up there for 3 weeks. I mean, don't do anything iffy in any of those Gulf states.
Did they ask you to stop vaping on the plane?
They could have just, I don't know, I mean, this is the irony, they could have just asked me to stop.
They didn't ask.
No, so what it was is you have this terrible thing, which is that all those airlines, which people love because the service is so good, okay, the one thing you've got to watch is that the staff are so terrified of losing their jobs, which they can lose in a heartbeat, that they basically follow everything to the letter. Now, I'm right back on British Airways or EasyJet after that, where you can kind of have, I mean, as my colleague said, my colleague whose mum worked for Aer Lingus, she said, if they imprisoned everybody on the Dublin to Boston flight for that behaviour, she said half the Irish population would be in jail. I mean, that business of what you might call low ambiguity cultures. And bear in mind, there are people in prison for having a girlfriend. Okay, there are people in the prison for bouncing a cheque. Now, when you go out and you rent a house out there, you write 12 predated checks. Okay, or post-dated checks rather, for each month of your rent, okay? If you forget that your rent check's coming up in 2 days' time and you go a little bit below that balance, okay?
So they're hardcore.
There's no question of your bank ringing you up and going, you need to put some more money in. You might have 100,000 quid in another bank account, right?
Understood.
Okay?
All right.
Straight to prison, right?
So it was a bad day.
What I suddenly realised is the thing that's most valuable, that genuinely the real underpinnings of freedom are living in a culture with some sort of sense of ambiguity around it, which is where you can say, yes, I get this, but under the circumstances, you know, in other words, where there's some sort of barter provision.
Okay. What was the best day of your life?
That's a really interesting question. I've had a very good, actually, yesterday was pretty good. My daughter's 18th birthday. I've got twin daughters.
Okay.
And there is unbelievable joy when they're 18, which is one, you're not held responsible anymore. So there's a slight feeling that I can actually now relax, for the first time in 20 years. You know, in other words, if something slightly bad happens to them, I don't mean something terrible, I'm still worried about that, but if something slightly bad happens to them, I'm no longer held up as being an appalling parent because they're 18. The second thing is the joy of being able to go on holiday whenever I like. The biggest bloody nuisance of children isn't the expense of school fees, clothes, etc., all of which you might actually to some extent welcome or feel worthwhile. The extraordinary restriction it has on your ability to go on holiday at times when it's actually less crowded and less expensive drives me nuts, because I hate leaving Britain in July and August. Why would you, right? Okay, I mean, the weather's never that bad in July and August. We have had 1 or 2 dud summers. Okay, I get it. But of all the times to leave the UK, okay, June, July, August, and early September are the stupidest times to travel abroad you can possibly conceive of. Because it's about as nice as it gets. And the stupid bastard school holidays, which were designed for fucking harvesting. They're not designed for holidays, they're designed for the bloody harvest. By making it impossible to go away in the winter and easy to go away in the summer, it is the most ludicrous, stupid, entrenched pattern of behaviour.
Your point has been made.
Yeah.
What scares you, Rory?
Health, obviously, always worried about. Scared about. Yeah, one of the interesting things is I realised how much fear is down to uncertainty and powerlessness rather than what we think it is, which fascinates me psychologically. So one of my children, and actually my wife and I, all use this thing called Life 360. I don't know if you know it. It's a mobile tracking service.
Yeah, I know it.
So you can see where everybody else.
Everyone is, I used to have it.
The other daughter won't use it. I respect her privacy decision not to use it. The only thing is that if you can't get hold of the one daughter and you can see where they are, you're not remotely bothered. Because you go, okay, if I can't get hold of her in another hour's time, another 2 hours' time, I know what I can do next, which is either go there, phone someone else, or whatever, okay? With the daughter where you can't get hold of her and you don't know where she is, you're absolutely bricking it. Because not only do you not know what's happening, okay, but you don't know what to do. And that fascinates me, that actually there's a kind of mental state which is, feelings of powerlessness seem to be what terrify us in a weird way, rather more than I suspect that's why a lot of people are frightened of flying, actually. It's the fear, I'm not, but it's the fear of something you can't do anything about.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And that interests me. So the other thing I think that we probably sometimes get frightened of the wrong things. We also get angry about the wrong things, I think. I mean, I think one of the worrying things about politics is that the behaviour of some of the social justice movement really gets to me on this, because if Trump says bad hombres, right, you get like 4 days of general crap about blah, 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 is this racist? Well, first of all, maybe it is, but it doesn't matter, because by making a massive fuss about that, what you're doing is totally counterproductive, because you're actually effectively giving Trump support. Because people who've used the phrase bad hombres, or who would use it, now go, well, if you're calling me a racist, I mean, screw you, I'm going to vote for this guy. Scott Adams was very, very good on all this stuff. He said, if you don't want Trump to win, stop calling him racist. He said, it's a totally counterproductive reaction.
Yeah, and it's happening
But
right
the
now.
other thing is, there are things that are really worthwhile to get angry about, okay? So I'm a right-of-centre Brit, okay? I'm a huge Americanophile, massive Americanophile. But I think your rate of incarceration as a country is batshit crazy.
It is.
So it's higher than China as a proportion of the population, right? I think it's the highest rate of proportion of your population is in prison at any one time of any country in the world.
I think so. It's like 1% or 1.7%.
I mean, and now some of that has to be, that can't be optimal, And the extent to which, by the way, it falls disproportionately on certain ethnic groups, a hugely high number of it is probably for fairly trivial drug-related offences, for instance. Now, my argument is, look, if you're getting really worried about gender pronouns and you're not really getting worried about the US rate of incarceration, okay, this is not a really great focus of time. Because there's something where, you could get perfectly sane people to have a debate about this. We could all have a perfectly sane debate, okay? And people outside academia, people outside your weird bubble could be persuaded here. okay? Vegetarianism, by the way, I think is an interesting thing. I think animal rights is a really interesting area where you could, I can see areas where, so the tragic thing with the left is that they have really good ideas and then for some reason they seem to get most excited by the bad ones.
Right. Yeah, I know. I see what you mean, and the less effective ones.
What the hell? I mean, there are loads and loads of really interesting issues here, but I mean, the gender bathrooms thing is not really. I mean, that's a really strange area in which to, use up that amount of mental energy.
Agreed.
And my contention is that you're doing it to signal your religiosity to your peer group, okay? So the second politics is more interested in signaling purity to its in-group than winning supporters from an out-group. Then essentially get out of that politics and go and find somewhere else. Making jobs by making it mandatory, which is bizarrely from the Conservative MP for Faversham, right, female MP. I've crazily forgotten her name. She's fantastic. Okay, but now that is a really interesting idea. So advertised jobs by default are advertised on flexible terms, unless you have a reason for them not to be. That's a really big idea. No one's talking about that.
Right. So focus on those big ones.
Yeah, focus on the big ones.
What keeps you awake at night, if anything?
Nothing much. I tend to sleep like a child, but what would keep me awake at night? One of the great things, I don't know if you noticed this, but one of the great things about being in late middle age is you do kind of have less things to. It's not that things worry you less, but that probably it's because actually once you're 50, the future course of your life has less variance than when you're 20. When you're 20, everything's to play for. You don't have anything in either the real or the metaphorical bank, and everything in the future is potentially possible both for good and ill. Now, as what you might call your life expectation variance seems to reduce with age, those kind of things which would have kept me awake in an agonized state 15 years ago don't really now. I think I'm apparently reaching this weird happiness thing where most people's happiness dips in middle to late middle age. And then as you get towards the middle of your 50s, people tend to cheer up. I think that's right, isn't it?
I don't know.
There is a bit of a kind of what's called the smile, which is that people start off happy, and happiness does seem to dip at a particular age, and then weirdly returns again.
Yeah.
Now, we ought to investigate what that is, because it's not to do with wealth. It might just be biological, but it might be something else as well. I wonder what that would be.
Could be your next book.
Well, that was another great moment, by the way, which is the curse of writing a book, of course, is for the period you're writing it, you never have any free time, because even when you're not doing anything, you could be writing the book. And that is having those sort of 2-year projects is really, really painful.
They take 2 years?
It's very weird. I made a very valuable discovery writing it, by the way, which is that 10 times 10 minutes isn't the same as 100 minutes. And similarly, 4 half days is not remotely as productive as 2 days in a row. And what I realized is in order to write things for whatever reason, and there's a wonderful paper by Paul Graham, the founder of Y Combinator, which is only basically a single page of A4, and it's called Maker Time versus Manager Time.
Yeah, I know this.
And the point is about Maker Time is long periods of uninterrupted time are what's necessary for Maker Time. And the reason a coder will get really pissed off if you put a 10-minute meeting in the middle of his afternoon is not because he's lost 10 minutes, it's because he's lost an afternoon.
Yeah.
And Graham claims they always tend to run Y Combinator on Maker Time. And they have large swathes. And what I discovered with the book is I probably wrote literally 80% of the book in 20% of the time I spent writing it. And that was because where I managed to actually get chunks of time free, I've got a flat in Deal on the Kent coast. When I went down for just 10 days and said, I'm not going to any birthday parties, I'm not reading my email, I'm not doing anything else. The first day was largely ineffectual. The second day was quite productive. The third day was very productive. And then I think after about 3 very productive days, I probably took a day off. But what you realize is there's nothing remotely linear about time and productivity.
That's good to know.
Yeah,
'Cause I'm
that
trying to
book,
write right now.
that paper by Maker Time versus Manager Time.
Yeah.
If there's one thing in business which everybody ought to read, I think it's that.
It's those. Yeah, we're a big fan of that here.
Mm.
That coffee I gave you is called Maker Mode Coffee.
Perfect.
So there you
Perfect.
go.
Yeah.
Rory, if you could pick up a phone and call up the 20-year-old Rory Sutherland and give that young man some advice. I guess you hadn't started Ogilvy yet. You're probably still at uni. What would you tell him?
I wouldn't say anything because that would change the course. And my general view is I've been lucky. And one of the things I'm also very, very keen on, as you'll notice, is I generally say you can influence your exposure to positive or negative luck, but you can't necessarily plan in advance how you want to get lucky. And I've been very, very lucky, genuinely, in that I suppose the fantastic luck, or the real luck was the first job, in path dependency terms, because I was working with people like Drayton Bird, who is probably the most brilliant copywriter in direct response advertising, certainly in Britain, possibly the world. I was at Ogilvy and May the Direct, it was then called, which was the direct marketing wing of Ogilvy. I had a brother who was an academic, so knew about the internet and the web 6 months before anybody in business had heard of them. Being in direct marketing was the perfect place to be when advertising started to make itself more digital. Yeah. I learnt from incredibly good people. Ogilvy had Randy Halfelder, my old art director Mike Sim, people like Jason King, Anthony Abdul, going back. There would have been Steve Harrison, obviously. Okay, so I was in this place where I kind of ended up there because it was actually at the end. I got quite a few second interviews. It was, I think, the only job offer I got. Interestingly, when I went for the interview, I liked it so much that had I had other job offers, I still would have taken Ogilvy and May the Direct, I think. An interesting question, by the way, had Ogilvy never written Ogilvy on advertising, which I'd read before, would I have been so keen to apply for Ogilvy? You see, this is one of those things about fame being asymmetric. But that was an extraordinarily lucky start. And then the other lucky start was the other lucky break, I think helped by quite a few of those people I've aforementioned, was being able to make a move from advertising account management to being a copywriter.
Okay.
The Spectator's been hugely lucky. That was again a product of a lucky invitation to a dinner with Matt D'Ancona, and who would have thought that's been bloody hell. 26. I must have written. Yeah, that must be 10 years now I've been writing for that. Wow. Maybe even longer, come to think of it. Crikey.
Okay, so if you have no advice for that young man, maybe you could tell me the best advice you ever received on marketing or on copywriting at Ogilvy.
Yeah, really interesting one. Start with the coupon. Which sounds really banal. And when we first heard it, we thought it was just a load of old school people. The point about start with the coupon, which is when you're writing a direct response ad, before you write the headline, you should make sure the coupon is perfect. And that shows the understanding that if you, in any process of selling, if you haven't got the last mile right, there's no point in improving the first mile.
So writing the coupon.
And so what that says is quite interesting. It says optimize backwards. And what that says to me, actually, is that if you start a government program, the first thing you should discuss is not how to advertise the program, how to promote the program, blah, 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 blah. You should start by saying, how do you apply for this program? Should you have to apply for it at all? Should it be automatic opt-in? So actually getting the last mile right first and then working backwards is a better way to improve a non-ergodic system.
Does that mean getting the product right before the marketing?
Well, emphatically, yeah. So, or in marketing terms, the experience, certainly, yeah. Because if the experience is no good, there's no point in selling the product because people only buy it once. It doesn't pay to do any marketing for something that people only buy once, unless it's a pension or one of those strange, once-in-a-lifetime, a funeral plan or whatever.
The
following success secrets are only available inside the London Real Tribe, where you get exclusive access and insights from our high-performance guests on wealth creation, productivity, leadership, morning routines, health, and well-being. To join our tribe community, go to londonreal.tv/tribe. Now, let's continue with the show.
That's good advice. Last one, advice to the 20-year-old that's watching us out there in the world or listening to us, Rory.
Be good at more than one thing. In other words, if you try, this is a sort of, it was very interesting when I read the Peter Thiel book, 0 to 1, because he kind of says something similar, which is, there's also a new book out which is in support of the generalist. But if you're trying to be the best tennis player in the world, okay, there will be a best tennis player in the world, but it's probably not going to be you. You're going to fail, okay? If you're strong in two related fields, then in the medium to long term, if there's some overlap between those two fields, you can become the most knowledgeable person in the world in A plus B. Trying to be the most knowledgeable person in the world in A, I mean, if you think about it, the whole of behavioral economics and a Nobel Prize for economics kind of emerged from the fact that the psychologists at Stanford sat next to the economists and used the same coffee room. And in the same way, I'd argue that the most interesting things emerge from the overlap of two things. And therefore, I think you should always have a side hustle, and you should always have a kind of intellectual hinterland. Because if you become too narrowly focused, to be absolutely honest, you're competing against too many people for the same very narrow, limited thing.
It's really good advice. So ideally take two fields and find somewhere in between.
It also lets you pivot, I think, because if one thing becomes, we can't predict the future. And so having two or three legs on which you can stand allows you to pivot much more easily than if you've bet the farm on one thing.
Powerful advice. The book is Alchemy, The Surprising Power of Ideas That Don't Make Sense. For me, I never studied marketing. I studied engineering at MIT, and I studied finance, and marketing always is this weird, dark art, and I think it always will be, and I think that's fascinating.
I think the people hate it because most of what people want from a business school is unambiguous advice. And the advice actually to marketers is become comfortable with ambiguity, because this is not a field with single right answers. It's not a field where there's equilibrium. The right answer today can be the wrong answer tomorrow. Look at London City Airport, okay? The fascinating thing is that for years, everybody went, oh, Changi, oh, Dubai Airport, oh, I've been to Schiphol, I bought a Walkman for 80 quid, oh, it's amazing, I couldn't believe it, okay? And then every airport has a bloody shopping centre attached. And people start going, London City Airport, it's brilliant, isn't it? You just check in, and 50 minutes later, you're boarding the plane. And so, because humans tend to notice what's new and distinctive, not what's important, and they make important what's distinctive, what's important to consumers isn't going to be static anyway.
Yeah. Rory, it's always fascinating talking to you. I'm sure we could talk for 2 more hours.
So much.
But thanks so much. This gives me a lot to think about, especially when it comes to marketing, what we do here as well.
Oh, brilliant.
Book is Alchemy. I'm guessing people can get it at Amazon and all the places they buy books. I encourage everyone to watch your TED Talks on YouTube. And Rory, until next time.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you
so
very
much
much indeed. Thank you ever so much.